I'd always been a fan of camping, the kind of person who loved to get away from the city noise and immerse myself in the solitude of nature. So when I had a few days off from work, I decided to take a solo trip up to a spot I'd never been before, a remote forest area in the mountains, far away from the usual hiking paths, the kind of place where you could disappear into the woods without anyone bothering you. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, a few supplies, and set off early one morning. The drive was long, the road winding its way up into the mountains, the trees getting denser the higher I climbed. There was a certain peace about it all, but something in the back of my mind kept nagging me, as if I was forgetting something important. I shook off the feeling. It was just nerves. I'd done this before. The air felt cooler as I pulled up to the parking area near the trailhead. There was a small dirt lot with space for maybe 3 or 4 cars. Not a soul in sight. Perfect. The trail I was taking was known to be isolated, rarely traveled by anyone. That's why I chose it. I checked my map, double-checked my pack, and set off down the path. The first few miles were easy, just a gentle slope through the forest. The scent of pine filled the air, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. It was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, remote, and peaceful. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I knew I needed to set up camp before it got too dark. I spotted a small clearing off the path, a nice spot beside a stream. Perfect. I unpacked my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood. As the fire crackled to life, I sat back and relaxed, watching the flames dance in the cool evening air. It was then that I noticed it, the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, or perhaps the sounds of wildlife. But something felt off. I kept glancing around, trying to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. But every time I looked, there was nothing. I brushed it off. I'd camped alone plenty of times before, and nothing had ever happened. But that night, as I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger. There was no sound, no rustling in the trees, but the sensation of being watched was inescapable. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Some other hiker? I couldn't see anything in the dark, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. I lay awake for what felt like hours, until I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. But that was when things started to get strange. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise, a rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the edge of the clearing. My heart started to race. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. It was too dark to see anything, but the sound was there, like something or someone was moving slowly around my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. I pointed it toward the noise, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anything nearby, just the still, quiet forest. I stood up and went outside, my eyes darting around the campsite. The fire had burned down to embers, but the darkness seemed thicker now, as if the trees were closing in around me. I walked a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, shining the flashlight in every direction. Nothing, just the wind, the trees swaying, the night air chilling my skin. I tried to calm myself. It was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else looking for food. I'd heard stories about animals creeping into campsites at night, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal. It was something else. I returned to my tent, zipping it up tightly. I tried to settle back into my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. The sounds outside had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered, hanging in the air like a cloud. Then, around 2 a.m., it happened again. A loud snap, like a twig breaking, just outside my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening for any other sounds. Then, From somewhere near the trees, I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't an animal noise, it was something too deliberate, too human. My blood ran cold. I couldn't just lie there anymore. I grabbed my backpack, slipped on my shoes, and quietly unzipped the tent. I had to get out of there. My mind raced as I moved quickly but quietly away from the campsite, back toward the trailhead. I didn't want to stick around to find out what was out there, waiting for me. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but I knew it was too far to turn back now. The forest seemed different in the darkness, the trees looming like shadows in the corner of my vision. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going. The cold was seeping into my bones, and the quiet around me was deafening. It felt like the whole world had gone silent, as if I was the only living thing left. And then, just as I thought I might break down from exhaustion, I saw the lights of the parking lot in the distance. My heart soared. I was so close. I kept moving toward it, my pace quickening. But when I reached the lot, something stopped me dead in my tracks. My car was still there, parked in the same spot I had left it. But the door was slightly ajar. I never left it like that. I remembered locking it, double-checking the door before I left. I cautiously approached the car, my breath coming in short bursts. I peered inside, expecting to see nothing. But there, in the back seat, was something I couldn't explain. A small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't there before. I knew that for sure. I reached inside the car, grabbing the paper and unfolding it. The words were simple, written in neat handwriting. You should have stayed where you were. I don't know how to explain it, but something about that note made my skin crawl. I didn't stick around to think about it. I slammed the car door shut, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped off, not daring to look back. The road twisted and turned as I drove, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. By the time I made it back home, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I've camped plenty of times since then, but I've never returned to that spot. And every time I think about it, I can still feel that uneasy sensation, the one that tells me I wasn't alone out there in those woods. Something was watching me that night, and I don't know if I'll ever understand what it was, or what it wanted. But one thing's for sure, I won't be going back to find out. I've always been someone who loved the outdoors. I'd spent countless weekends camping in the forests around my town, feeling at home surrounded by towering trees, the scent of pine filling the air, and the sound of birds chirping. My friends and I had been on dozens of hiking trips, and I had never been afraid of the woods. But that all changed one late fall weekend when I decided to camp alone. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me, a small tent, my backpack, and the quiet of nature.
No distractions, no responsibilities.
I'd set up camp in a remote area near a creek that I knew well. It was a spot I'd camped at before with friends, but this time I was by myself. The weather was cold, but the sun was still out, casting long shadows through the trees as I made my way in. I set up my tent without any trouble, and then started gathering firewood. The quiet was almost oppressive at times, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of water flowing. By sunset, I had a fire going, and I sat back to enjoy the warmth as the night slowly crept in. I had packed light, just enough for a couple of nights. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nips at your fingers and toes but isn't unbearable. It was perfect camping weather, really. The forest around me seemed alive, with the wind shifting the branches and the sound of small animals skittering through the underbrush. Everything was as it always had been when I'd come here before. As the night wore on, the forest grew even quieter. The fire crackled in front of me, its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the trees. But as the fire burned lower, I began to notice something strange. The usual nighttime sounds of animals and insects, cicadas, owls, the occasional scurrying of a mouse, had stopped. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnervingly silent. Even the wind had died down. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, the woods can get quiet sometimes. But the longer the silence stretched, the more uncomfortable I became. My mind began to race, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, expecting to see something or someone, standing just out of sight. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the fire. I had come out here to get away from the noise of daily life, to enjoy the stillness. But the stillness felt off, like the world was holding its breath. The fire was starting to die down, and I stood up to add more wood. As I turned toward the pile I had gathered earlier, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker of something. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. I froze. There, in the shadows just beyond the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't clear at first, just a shape half hidden behind the trees. But it was definitely there, standing still, watching me. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My heart rate increased, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The figure didn't move, just stood there, like it was waiting for something. It wasn't like a person. It was too tall, too broad. I couldn't see any details, but I knew instinctively that it wasn't something I wanted to get closer to. My mind was racing now. I thought about the animals that could live in this forest. Deer, bears, mountain lions, but nothing fit the description of what I was seeing. I reached for the knife on my belt, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled it free. It felt like the only thing that might give me any sense of control. I watched the figure for what felt like an eternity. The seconds stretched and I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The figure vanished into the darkness, slipping away as silently as it had come. I stood there for a long time after that, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that it had been a shadow or a trick of my mind. But the unease in my gut wouldn't fade. The silence pressed in on me again, heavier this time, and I could feel my nerves fraying. I didn't want to stay outside anymore. I quickly gathered up what little firewood I had left and scrambled to stoke the fire back to life, my hands shaking as I worked. I didn't know if I was trying to make the fire bigger for warmth or for safety, but the more I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination, the more the feeling of being watched returned. The fire crackled and popped, its bright orange flames dancing in the dark. But even as I sat back down, the sensation of being stared at didn't go away. It was as if something or someone was out there, just beyond the light of the fire, waiting for me to let my guard down. Hours passed. I tried to ignore the creeping paranoia that kept gnawing at me, but it was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like a threat. My thoughts kept returning to the figure. What had it been? Who had it been? I stayed close to the fire for the rest of the night, barely able to sleep. When I did doze off, I woke with a start, thinking I heard something. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my overactive imagination, but the sounds of the night didn't feel natural anymore. They felt wrong. The next morning, I woke early, exhausted and jumpy. I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to stay in the spot any longer than necessary. The forest, which had felt so comforting just a day before, now felt menacing, the trees towering like silent sentinels around me. I left the campsite in a hurry, glancing over my shoulder as I made my way down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small place where I could finally breathe without feeling the weight of the woods pressing down on me. The whole trip had shaken me more than I'd expected. I wasn't sure what had happened out there. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something in those woods I didn't understand. I never went back to that spot, and I didn't tell anyone the full story. People would laugh it off, think I was just being paranoid. But I knew what I saw, and the feeling of being watched never truly left me. There are places in the woods, quiet, remote places that hold secrets. I don't know if the woods around that creek have one, but I wasn't willing to find out. And to this day, whenever I hear the sound of wind rustling through the trees or the quiet hum of the forest at night, I can't help but remember that feeling of being watched. The forest might look peaceful, but it has its dark corners. And sometimes, the things that lurk in those corners aren't easily explained. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip, a quick getaway to a remote part of the mountains for a camping trip with a few friends. Nothing too fancy, just the simple joys of being surrounded by nature and getting away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But I had no idea that this trip would be anything but ordinary. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, casting long shadows through the towering pines. The air was fresh, crisp, perfect for a weekend in the woods. I had been to this spot before. It was a quiet, peaceful place, far from the nearest town, and the kind of location where you could really lose yourself in the beauty of nature. At least that's what I thought. We parked the car, unloaded the gear, and set up camp near a small creek that trickled through the forest. The sound of water was soothing, like a natural lullaby. We built a fire pit, pitched our tents, and settled in for the evening. The plan was simple: enjoy some good food, tell stories, and relax under the stars. As the night approached, I could feel a change in the atmosphere. The air grew cooler, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch further into the forest. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks into the air. It was beautiful, no doubt, but there was something else, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I couldn't quite place it, but the woods seemed different somehow. The quiet was deeper than usual, like the forest was holding its breath. The night went on, and the usual campfire chatter filled the space. We roasted marshmallows, laughed, and joked like any group of friends would. But as the hours passed, a strange feeling settled in my gut, like something was watching us from the darkness beyond the fire's light. I kept glancing over my shoulder into the trees, trying to shake off the unease, but the feeling only grew stronger. At some point, I stepped away from the fire to get some fresh air. The others were still talking, their voices muffled by the crackling of the fire. I walked a little ways past the edge of the camp, where the forest grew thick with underbrush. The trees felt closer here, almost as if they were leaning in to listen to my every step. As I stood there, looking into the darkness of the forest, I thought I heard something, a rustle in the underbrush. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a deer or some smaller creature, but then I heard it again. This time, it sounded deliberate, like something or someone was moving through the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I quickly turned and hurried back to the camp. When I returned, I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered. The others noticed my discomfort, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make them worry, especially since we were so far from civilization. I just sat down by the fire and tried to focus on the warmth it provided. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and crack in the woods seemed amplified. The wind had picked up, causing the branches of the trees to sway and groan. Every now and then, I would hear a strange noise, a snap of a twig, a rustling of leaves, but I told myself it was just animals, nothing to be afraid of. Yet, the feeling of being watched never went away. The next morning, I woke up early, still feeling uneasy from the night before. The others were still asleep in their tents, so I decided to go for a walk by the creek. The sound of the water was calming, and I hoped it would help clear my head. As I walked along the bank, I tried to focus on the beauty of the place. the sunlight filtering through the trees, the gentle flow of the water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I noticed it. There, just beyond the creek, was a strange set of footprints in the mud. They were too big to be from any animal, and they didn't match the boots or shoes the group had been wearing. They were deep, like someone had been walking through the soft earth with a heavy stride. I felt a sudden sense of dread settle in my stomach. The footprints led off into the woods, disappearing into the thick underbrush. I didn't want to follow them. I really didn't, but something pulled me forward. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the trail and followed the tracks, my feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The air grew heavier, colder, and the sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustling of leaves, faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. I walked for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints seemed to go on forever, leading me deeper into the forest, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know who or what had made them. The forest had become eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just out of sight. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. Eventually, the footprints stopped at the base of an old, twisted tree. Its bark was gnarled, and its roots stretched out like claws, reaching into the ground. I crouched down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I noticed something strange. There, wedged between the roots of the tree, was a small object, a tattered backpack, the kind you might see on a hiker. I froze. This was no coincidence. I reached out cautiously, my hand trembling, and unzipped the backpack. Inside, I found a few personal items: clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight. But the most chilling thing was a small journal, its pages yellowed and torn at the edges. I flipped it open, my stomach twisting as I read the first few lines of the entry. Day 3. I can hear them. They're getting closer. I think I'm being followed. The rest of the journal was full of similar entries, each one more frantic and desperate than the last. The last entry was scrawled in a shaky hand, barely legible. They're here. I can hear them now, right outside. I don't know how much longer I can stay hidden. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. Who had left this behind? Had someone been lost out here? And what had happened to them? I looked around, my mind spinning with fear. The footprints were gone now, lost in the underbrush. It was as if the person who had made them had vanished into thin air. But I wasn't alone out here. I could feel it. Someone or something was watching me. I quickly turned and ran back toward the camp, my breath coming in short gasps. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in on all sides. The only thing I could focus on was getting back to safety. When I finally reached the camp, my friends were up and preparing breakfast. They looked at me with concern when they saw the panic on my face, but I didn't tell them what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to share what I had found. Instead, I just tried to act normal, forcing a smile as I helped set up the fire. We packed up and left the campsite that morning, none of us saying a word about the strange feeling that had settled over us. I never went back to that place, and I never told anyone about the journal or the footprints. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. I can still remember the feeling of being watched, the sense of dread that hung over me like a cloud. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods that day, but I'll never forget the way it felt. The forest is vast, and there are things in it that we'll never understand. And maybe that's for the best. I've always loved the quiet of the woods. Growing up in Vermont, I spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking, camping, and just enjoying nature. I thought I knew the wilderness pretty well, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that trip to the mountains last summer. It all started when a few friends and I decided to take a weekend camping trip in a remote area of the Swiss Alps. It wasn't a popular spot, and we knew that made it perfect. No crowds, no noise, just us and the wilderness. We packed our gear carefully, double-checked everything, and headed out, feeling excited about the adventure. The drive up the winding mountain roads was smooth at first, but as we got higher, the air grew cooler and the trees thickened. By the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the peaks. We decided to set up camp near a stream we had spotted on a map. It seemed like the perfect spot, secluded, with a great view of the mountains and plenty of firewood nearby. Setting up the tent was easy, and we got a campfire going quickly. The flames flickered against the evening air, casting long shadows on the trees around us. The night was calm, too calm, maybe. I don't know why, but something felt off. Maybe it was just the isolation, the silence that enveloped us once the fire crackled down to embers. We joked around, talked about old stories from school, and sipped on our drinks, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the night wore on, the chill in the air grew sharper, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the usual discomfort of being in the wilderness at night. But then, around midnight, something strange happened. I heard a noise, soft at first, like the sound of something moving through the brush. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar. But as the sound grew louder and closer, I realized it wasn't any animal I knew. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the snap of twigs you get from the usual forest creatures. It was something different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was like footsteps, but not quite. The way the noise moved, uneven, almost like something was dragging itself through the underbrush, gave me chills. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My friends had gone quiet, their faces lit only by the flickering fire. We all sat still for a few moments, listening. The sound continued, getting closer, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. It wasn't on the trail. It was coming from somewhere in the dense woods around us. The trees were thick, but I could swear I saw something move in the shadows. My heart started to beat faster, but I tried to push it down. It was just an animal, I told myself. Probably a bear, maybe even a mountain lion, though I didn't think they'd be this close to our camp. But the sound didn't stop. It continued, dragging, slow and steady, like whatever was making it was circling us. It didn't make sense. Why wouldn't it just move away? Why wasn't it trying to get away from the light of the fire? I felt my skin prickle with unease, but we all just sat there, waiting. I could tell everyone else felt it too. The tension in the air was thick, and no one was brave enough to speak. Then the sound stopped. For a second, I thought we might have imagined it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow in the trees. At first, it was just a flicker, nothing concrete, but as I stared at the dark shapes, I saw it more clearly. Something was moving between the trunks of the trees, just outside the reach of the firelight. It was tall, hunched over, like it was trying to hide itself from us. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. I'd seen something. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a deer. Whatever it was moving intentionally, like it was watching us. The silence that followed was unbearable. We all exchanged nervous glances but didn't speak. Finally, one of my friends, Matt, broke the silence, his voice a little too loud. "It's probably just a deer. We're in their territory, after all." His words didn't have the comfort he probably intended. We all knew it wasn't a deer. We decided to stay up, keeping the fire burning hot and bright. The crackling flames seemed to keep the dark at bay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the trees made my heart race. Every branch that snapped made me jump. Eventually, around 3 a.m., we decided to go to bed. The fire was still burning, though not as fiercely as before, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy as I crawled into my sleeping bag. The tent felt too small, too thin, like it wouldn't keep out whatever was out there. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to every sound in the night. My friends were already asleep, but I couldn't find peace. I heard the distant sound of running water from the stream, the rustle of the trees in the wind, and just at the edge of my hearing, the soft sound of something moving in the woods again. The night passed without incident, but the next morning, things didn't feel any better. We packed up our camp and decided to hike out to another spot a few miles away, hoping a change of scenery would calm our nerves. As we trekked through the dense forest, the whole area seemed off. The trees were too close together, the air too still. Felt like we were being watched, like we weren't alone. We arrived at a small clearing by noon, a place that looked a little more open, and decided to stop for lunch. The feeling of unease didn't lift, though. We ate in silence, and I kept my eyes on the woods around us. That's when it happened again. The dragging sound, closer this time, moving through the brush. This time, it was too much. We all stood up at once, ready to run if we needed to, but we didn't. We stayed frozen, listening. The sound stopped, and the woods were still. We waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. The tension in the air was thick, but it wasn't until we decided to pack up and head back to the car that we realized we'd been followed. We were a few miles from our campsite when we saw it. Drag marks. They led right up to the spot where we'd had lunch. The ground was soft enough that you could see the uneven pattern, like something heavy had been pulled through the forest. The marks stopped just at the edge of the trees. We looked at each other, our faces pale. There was no question anymore. Whatever had been out there wasn't just an animal. We didn't wait around to figure it out. We made our way back to the car quickly, trying not to panic, but we all knew we wouldn't be coming back to that spot. As we drove down the mountain, the tension slowly eased, but none of us spoke about it. We didn't need to. By the time we made it back to civilization, I thought I had shaken off the fear, but it's been months now, and the feeling hasn't left. Every time I go camping, every time I hear a rustle in the woods, I remember that dragging sound. I don't know what it was, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that part of the mountains again. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but I always loved the idea of being out in the wilderness, just me and nature. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, a place I hadn't been to before, thinking it would offer a bit more peace and solitude. The air was crisp, the trees swayed gently with the wind, and the smell of pine was thick around me. Everything seemed perfect. I arrived at the campsite just as the sun started to dip behind the trees. The temperature was starting to drop, but it wasn't uncomfortable yet. I unloaded my gear, set up the tent, and started a fire. I've done this countless times before, so everything felt second nature to me. There was a creek not too far from where I set up, its gentle gurgling adding to the peaceful atmosphere. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, I cooked some food, enjoying the solitude. There was something peaceful about being alone in the wilderness, just me and the sounds of nature. But as I sat by the fire, the trees around me started to creak in a way that felt different. The wind had picked up slightly, but the sound of the branches moving through the air felt heavier, almost as if something was moving through the trees, though there was no reason for that. I brushed it off. It was probably just an animal. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the forest floor, making the trees look like strange, twisted shapes. I noticed how still it was around me, a kind of quiet that only comes when everything else in the forest seems to have gone to sleep. Then I heard it, a faint crack of a twig. It was almost too subtle to hear, but it was enough to make my head snap in the direction of the sound. My heart skipped a beat. I strained my ears, listening for more, but all I could hear was the crackling fire and the distant murmur of the creek. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, both of which I had seen earlier when setting up camp. But the feeling wouldn't leave. I was suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The only light was from the fire, and everything beyond that was pure black. My instincts were on high alert, but I couldn't tell why. I scanned the trees again, but the shadows had grown deeper, and I couldn't make out much. I decided to finish my meal and then go to bed. Maybe I was just tired. I needed rest. I poked the fire, trying to keep it going, but my mind kept drifting back to the feeling that something was wrong. The wind picked up again, this time louder, causing the trees to sway more violently. The sound of branches creaking in the wind became overwhelming, and the night seemed to close in around me. I finished my food and cleaned up, throwing everything into my backpack and putting it to the side. I was ready for bed, but as I turned to unzip my tent, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shape darting between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to catch, but it was there. My pulse raced. My first instinct was to chalk it up to my tired eyes, but the movement had been too deliberate. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The wind howled again, and I could swear I heard a rustling sound, almost like footsteps, only louder than anything an animal could make. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods. Nothing. Just shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The more I stood there, the more it felt like the woods around me were closing in, pressing against me. I hurriedly unzipped the tent and crawled inside, fastening it shut as quickly as I could. Inside the tent, I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The wind, the darkness, the unfamiliar forest. It was enough to make anyone feel uneasy. I lay down, trying to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak, every gust of wind, every snap of a twig made me jump. My mind was racing. Was there someone out there? Or was it just my imagination? The night stretched on, and I found myself wide awake, staring at the faint glow of the firelight that flickered through the tent fabric. The sounds of the forest had grown quieter, and I thought I could finally drift off to sleep. But then, there was that sound again. A twig snapping, followed by a soft rustling noise. My heart thudded in my chest. I wasn't imagining it this time. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear. The noise was closer now, like someone or something was circling the campsite. My mind raced as I grabbed the flashlight from beside me, shining it through the mesh of the tent, but I saw nothing. I couldn't just sit there. I had to know what was out there. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, barely making a sound, and poked my head out. The fire was still burning, but the shadows it cast seemed to have taken on a life of their own. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the sound of the creek was almost drowned out by the silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening. There was no sound now, nothing, just the wind moving the branches. I had to admit, I was starting to feel ridiculous. I had to be overreacting. It was just an animal or maybe a hiker passing by. The woods weren't that dangerous, right? I sat back down, trying to shake the unease from my bones. I could still hear the wind howling through the trees, but the forest felt emptier now, quieter than before. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. My eyes kept darting to the shadows, as if expecting something to jump out at me. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the trees behind me. I jumped to my feet, my flashlight flashing wildly. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, the beam of light cutting through the night. The trees were silent. There was nothing there, but the noise had been real. The ground had trembled, and I could have sworn I saw movement. something large shifting in the darkness. My stomach churned with a primal fear I couldn't explain. I backed away from the fire, heart racing, flashlight scanning the trees. My head was spinning. This couldn't be happening. No one was supposed to be out here. I was miles from the nearest road. No one should be close to my campsite. Yet, the longer I stood there, the more the fear gnawed at me. Something was wrong. I stood frozen, listening for any more sounds. I was starting to wonder if I should pack up and leave, but I couldn't do that. Not in the middle of the night. I was alone, and leaving my campsite wasn't an option. The fire, the tent, everything I had brought with me would be useless if I didn't stay. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I waited for the next sound, the next sign of movement. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet again. Too quiet. There was no rustling, no wind, no creak, just the eerie stillness of the forest. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Whatever it was gone. The fire flickered in front of me, providing the only light in the otherwise pitch-black wilderness. I decided to stay put, to try to sleep. I could feel my body slowly relaxing, the tension in my muscles easing. Maybe I was just overthinking everything. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as I lay back down, I heard one last noise, a faint whisper of movement near the edge of the camp, close to where the trees met the clearing. My flashlight was still in my hand, and I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white with fear. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. But this time, I wasn't running. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my actions. I would face whatever was out there. In the end, it turned out to be nothing more than an animal, a large deer, coming too close to my camp. The rustling and snapping of branches had been its antlers brushing against the trees. But for hours, I had convinced myself it was something far worse. The fear of the unknown had almost driven me to pack up and leave. But in the end, the night passed. I woke up in the morning, the light filtering through the trees, and for the first time, I could fully see the beauty of the place I had chosen. I packed up my things and left without looking back, grateful that I had stayed, but also relieved to be leaving the unsettling stillness behind. The sun had just set, and the forest around me was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when you're deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. I had been hiking for hours, and I was tired. I had planned this solo camping trip for weeks, looking forward to the peace and quiet, the solitude, the feeling of being completely alone with nature. But now, as the shadows grew longer and the sky turned dark, I began to feel a sense of unease creeping in. Something about the forest felt different tonight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. I had found a small clearing near a stream, perfect for setting up camp. The ground was soft with moss, and I had a nice view of the water. The firewood I gathered earlier was stacked beside my tent, and my camp stove was ready to go. I set up my tent quickly, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. It was getting colder, and the wind was picking up, rustling the trees above me. I didn't mind the cold, but the wind, it felt strange. There was something unsettling about how it moved through the trees, like it was whispering something. I tried to push the feeling aside as I lit my camp stove. The warm light of the flames flickered in the growing darkness, and the smell of food started to fill the air. I was hungry, having hiked all day, and the simple act of cooking helped to calm my nerves. As I ate, I kept my eyes on the surrounding woods, listening to the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. Every now and then, a branch would snap, but I didn't pay much attention to it at first. I was too tired, too focused on my meal. But then I heard it again, a snap, closer this time. I froze mid-bite, my fork hovering in the air. My heart began to race. It was too quiet for animals to be moving around. At least that's what I told myself. The wind rustled the leaves, but this sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. I stood up, putting my plate down beside the fire. My eyes scanned the tree line, but all I could see was the flickering darkness, shadows that seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, pointing it in the direction where I'd heard the noise. The beam of light cut through the trees, revealing only the dense underbrush and thick trunks of trees. There was nothing there. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of hiking. Still, I felt uneasy. I checked my campsite, ensuring everything was secure. The tent was zipped up tight, the food was stored in a bear-proof bag, and the fire was crackling steadily. Everything should have been fine, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would help clear my head. I zipped myself into the tent and lay down, staring up at the fabric above me, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of tree branches. The darkness outside was complete, the kind of darkness you only get in the deep forest, where the sky is hidden by a canopy of leaves. I was about to drift off when I heard it again. This time, it was louder, a footstep. It was unmistakable, the soft crunch of a foot on dry leaves. My heart raced again, and I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. The noise was coming from just outside my tent, maybe 5 feet away. I could hear the rustling of the leaves as whoever or whatever was out there moved around. I was terrified, but I didn't want to make a sound. I lay perfectly still, trying to listen, to figure out what was going on. The footsteps stopped, and for a few moments, everything was silent. Then I heard a low sound, almost like a grunt, but it wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, and it sent a chill through my spine. What the hell was that? I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little, careful not to make too much noise. My hand trembled as I held the flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. The beam swept across the area, illuminating the trees, the rocks, and the underbrush. But there was nothing there, nothing at all. I was starting to second-guess myself. Maybe it was an animal, some kind of predator, moving around the camp. I had heard about bears in the area, though I didn't think they would be active this late in the year. Still, the sound I had heard didn't match anything I had read about. Bears didn't grunt like that, did they? I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just hearing things. But the unease never left. My mind kept racing, and every little sound outside made me tense up. The wind, the rustling of leaves, even the crackle of the fire. It all felt too loud, too threatening. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the inside of my tent, waiting for the sound to come again. But it didn't. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, my dreams filled with strange noises and shadowy figures in the trees. When I woke up, it was still dark outside, the fire long since burned out, and the chill in the air had deepened. The first light of dawn was just starting to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I felt the weight of the night pressing on me, the fear still lingering in my chest. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but I knew I needed to get moving. The woods weren't a place to linger when something felt wrong. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands shaking slightly as I folded the tent and stashed my gear. My mind was racing, thinking about the sounds, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Couldn't shake it. I kept looking over my shoulder as I gathered my things, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, just beyond the trees. When I finally got everything packed, I turned to leave the clearing, but something stopped me. A flash of movement in the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring into the woods. It wasn't much, just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to send a surge of panic through me. I wasn't alone. I turned and ran. The trail was narrow and winding, But I didn't care. I didn't stop to think. I just ran, my feet pounding the dirt, the sound of my breath harsh in the cold morning air. I didn't look back. I could feel the weight of the forest closing in on me, the trees pressing in on all sides, as if they were closing off my escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I broke through the trees and found the main trail again. My legs were burning, my chest heaving, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down until I was sure I was far enough from the campsite. When I finally came to a stop, gasping for breath, I collapsed on the ground, my back against a tree. I stayed there for a long time, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. I had never been so scared in my life. The woods, the darkness, the sounds. It had all felt too real, too close. But I was safe now. I stayed on the trail, walking quickly and purposefully, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station several hours later. I told them about the strange noises, the footsteps, but they just nodded, used to hearing such stories from hikers. Still, I never went camping alone again. And every time I think about that night, I remember the fear, the feeling of being watched, and the sound of footsteps in the dark. Something was out there, something that wasn't quite right. But whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. And I never did. The air was cool against my skin, but it wasn't cold enough to make me shiver. I was standing at the edge of a small clearing in the woods, the tall trees swaying gently in the breeze above me. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a bird calling, but everything else was quiet. The kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. I wasn't alone, though. There was a small group of us, 4 in total, heading out on what was supposed to be a fun, relaxing camping trip. I was the one who suggested it. I had grown up hiking and camping, so I figured it would be a great way to reconnect with nature, get away from the noise of everyday life, and maybe even face a few fears along the way. I set up my tent first, at the far end of the clearing near the trees, hoping to have a bit of peace and quiet. The others did the same, laughing and talking as they picked their spots. The campsite had been chosen carefully, away from any potential hazards, near a creek for water, and surrounded by a few thick patches of trees that would offer some shelter. We'd hiked for hours to get here, making our way through dense forest trails and over rocky paths. The walk had been exhausting, but the kind of exhaustion that felt good at the end, the kind where you could sit back and relax by a campfire and forget about everything else. But there was something different about this place, something that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. It started when we first arrived. The clearing looked untouched, almost too perfect. The trees surrounding it were thick, but not so thick that you couldn't see the sky through the gaps. The grass was high, but not overgrown. The whole scene was just too still. First, I brushed it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me after the long hike. But as I set up my tent and unpacked my gear, that feeling lingered, nagging at the back of my mind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the solitude of the wilderness getting to me. I thought about how nice it would be to just settle in, start a fire, and relax for the evening. But every time I looked around the clearing, the feeling wouldn't go away. After setting up my tent, I walked over to the small fire pit we had built earlier. The others were already gathering firewood, talking in low voices. One of them, Adam, had brought a small axe to chop down some fallen branches. He swung it carefully, the sharp crack of wood splitting echoing in the otherwise quiet forest. It was comforting in its own way, grounding. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. I could smell the earth, the dampness of the trees, and the fresh scent of the firewood. Felt like everything was just settling into place. But then, as the shadows grew longer, the stillness became heavier. The air was getting cooler, But it wasn't just the temperature that felt different, it was the silence. There were no animals calling in the distance.
No birds, no insects buzzing.
Not even the rustling of the wind in the leaves. That was when I started to notice something. The trees around the clearing seemed too close. It was as if they were pressing in, slowly closing the space around us. It wasn't noticeable at first, but I kept glancing at them, feeling like the edges of the forest were drawing near, creeping closer. I told myself it was nothing. I was tired, a little too much sun. Maybe I was imagining things. But the longer I stared at the trees, the more I began to feel like they weren't just trees. They were watching. Dinner was simple, just some packaged food we had brought along for the trip. The fire crackled as we ate, the warmth of the flames fighting against the growing chill in the air. We ate in silence mostly, each of us lost in our thoughts. Afterward, we sat around the fire, poking at the embers with sticks and telling stories. It was easy to forget the feeling of unease as the night wore on, the warmth from the fire making everything feel safer. But then, as we sat there, the feeling returned. This time, it wasn't just the trees. It was the air itself. It felt thick, almost oppressive, like something was waiting for us in the dark beyond the firelight. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Adam shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the edge of the clearing. I saw the others doing the same, glancing nervously at the woods as though they, too, could feel something lurking just out of sight. We sat there for a while, each of us trying to pretend that everything was fine. But the firelight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the ground, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The breeze that had been gentle earlier had picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak. It was then that we heard it, a sound, faint at first but unmistakable. It was coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear. But the sound was too deliberate, too human. It was a rustling, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Slow, careful, like someone or something was moving through the trees trying to stay hidden. I glanced at the others, but no one spoke. We just sat there, frozen, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the wind whispering through the leaves. I thought maybe it had been nothing. Maybe it had been an animal after all. But the silence that followed felt wrong. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the forest. It was heavy, filled with an unspoken tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And then the sound came again. This time it was closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. Someone or something was moving toward us, and it wasn't trying to hide anymore. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I stood up slowly, my feet unsteady as I tried to peer into the darkness. But all I could see was the faint outline of trees, stretching out like dark fingers reaching for us. The others stood too, their faces pale in the firelight, their eyes wide with fear. We all stood in silence, the only sound the pounding of our hearts and the occasional crack of a twig. I couldn't tell how long we stood there, frozen, but eventually, the footsteps stopped, just like that, as if whatever had been out there had decided to leave. The relief was instant. The tension seemed to lift from the air, but it wasn't gone completely. It lingered, like an unwelcome guest who wouldn't leave. We decided to stay up for a while, watching the shadows in the trees, but nothing else happened. The fire burned low, and eventually, we crawled into our tents, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I kept imagining the footsteps moving closer, but whenever I opened my eyes, there was nothing, just the darkness pressing in on me. In the morning, the camp seemed normal. The sun was shining, the birds were singing. Everything felt safe again. But the feeling from the night before stayed with me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. As we packed up to leave, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder at the trees. The clearing looked peaceful in the daylight, but I knew something was out there, something that had been watching us. I never told the others what I had felt. They seemed fine, as if nothing had happened at all. But as I walked away from that campsite, my heart heavy with unease, I knew one thing for certain. I would never come back to this place again, and I would never forget the feeling of being watched. I'd never really been into camping before, but when my friends suggested we take a trip to the mountains, something about the idea seemed appealing. It wasn't like I'd never spent time in the outdoors. I'd hiked a few trails and spent the occasional night under the stars. But this was different. This time, we weren't going to any of the well-trodden, tourist-friendly spots. No, we were heading to a remote stretch of forest that few people knew about. And, at least in theory, it sounded like the kind of adventure I needed. We drove for hours, the landscape gradually changing as we went deeper into the wilderness. The road narrowed as the trees thickened around us. Pine and fir trees towered over us, and the air began to feel cooler, fresher. There was something calming about it, the isolation of the place, the sense of being far away from the chaos of everyday life. When we reached the campsite, the first thing that struck me was the silence. There were no sounds of birds, no wind rustling the branches, just an eerie stillness that felt almost unnatural. It was strange. I had expected it to be quiet in the woods, but not this absolute. My friends didn't seem to notice, though. They were excited, already unloading gear, talking about setting up the tents and starting the fire. I forced the uneasy feeling down, reminding myself that it was probably just the isolation. We set up camp near a small clearing, just off a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods. The air was crisp, the evening sky already beginning to darken. We built a fire, and the orange glow flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The warmth felt good against the cooling evening air, and the smell of burning wood was oddly comforting. But that feeling of unease didn't go away. As the darkness settled in, I found myself listening more closely to the sounds around me. The crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves, and then a soft crunching sound. It wasn't from any of my friends, who were sitting nearby, chatting or poking at the fire. It was distant, coming from deeper in the forest. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was so deliberate, so consistent, that it felt wrong. I ignored it for a while, focusing on the warmth of the fire, trying to push away the growing tension in my chest. But the sound kept coming, getting closer. Each crunch of dry leaves made my skin crawl, a sense of being watched slowly growing. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way everything else seemed to be so quiet, almost as if the world around us was holding its breath. "Hey, I'm going to check something out," I said, standing up abruptly, hoping to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over me. My friends barely looked up, too caught up in their own conversations. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way toward the trees, trying to act casual. The crunching sound stopped as I walked, but I could feel my nerves tightening with each step I took. It was darker now, the trees looming over me like silent watchers. I walked for what felt like an eternity, shining the light around, but there was nothing. No animals, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Just the quiet forest, as still as ever. I turned back, a sense of relief washing over me as I re-entered the small clearing where my friends were sitting, still oblivious to whatever was causing the unease. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the place. I convinced myself it was nothing and sat back down, focusing on the fire. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the feeling of unease lingered. Sleep came fitfully, disturbed by strange noises that I couldn't quite identify. Twigs snapping, something heavy brushing against the trees, the wind picking up and howling in the distance. Every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. By morning, I was exhausted, but as the sun rose, casting light through the trees, everything seemed calm again. The world felt like it had returned to normal. My friends were already up and bustling around, eager to start the day. I tried to shake off the dread I'd felt last night, but it wasn't easy. I knew something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. We decided to go for a hike that day, following the trail that twisted through the forest. The further we went, the quieter it got. There was no bird song, no rustling leaves. It was as though the forest had gone completely still again. I looked at my friends, hoping they would say something, anything, that would ease the tension building inside me, but they seemed oblivious. To them, everything was just a regular hike. I stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence press in on me. The forest felt too big, too empty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I looked around, eyes darting between the trees. There was something about the way the shadows moved, something strange in the air. "Hey, you guys feel that?" I asked, but no one seemed to notice. They were too busy taking photos, chatting, enjoying the view. I pressed on, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as though we were being followed, stalked by something or someone that I couldn't see. We reached a small ridge, overlooking a valley. The view was stunning, and for a moment, the beauty of it distracted me. But as I looked down into the valley, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. A figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. It wasn't moving, just standing there, too still. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, it was gone. I felt my heart race, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid in front of my friends. They'd already think I was overreacting if I said anything. We continued on, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As we descended into the valley, the air grew colder, and the oppressive silence returned. It felt like the woods were closing in on us. My friends were still talking, but their voices felt distant, muffled, as if they were fading away, and all I could hear was the thumping of my own heart. It was then that I realized we had made a wrong turn somewhere. The trail we had been following was no longer visible, and we were surrounded by dense trees with no obvious path forward. The daylight seemed to be dimming faster than it should have, and the chill in the air was becoming unbearable. The woods around us felt wrong. I tried to keep my voice steady as I suggested we turn back, but my friends were too busy admiring the view to notice. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I started walking back, my pace quickening with each step. The air seemed heavier, and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot was the only sound I could hear. The trees felt like they were closing in, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me harder with each passing minute. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I saw it, the campsite just ahead. I broke into a run, not caring how ridiculous it looked, just wanting to get back to safety. When I finally made it to the clearing, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The fire pit was still there, and my friends were sitting around, completely unaware of how much time had passed. But as I approached, I stopped in my tracks. There, at the edge of the clearing, was something I hadn't seen before. A set of footprints, large and heavy, leading into the forest. They weren't from any of us, and they were fresh. I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that we needed to leave. Now, I gathered my friends, telling them it was time to pack up. They were confused, but I didn't care. As we hastily packed our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. When we finally left the campsite, I felt the tension lift, but I didn't dare look back. The woods were too quiet, too still, and I knew that whatever was out there, whatever had been following us, was still in those trees. We drove away, the sound of the engine a welcome distraction from the silence that had nearly consumed us. By the time we hit the main road, the feeling of being watched finally began to fade. But I couldn't forget what I'd seen, what we'd all felt, and I knew, deep down, that the forest would always hold that strange, unsettling stillness that would haunt me for a long time. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. There's something about getting out into the wilderness, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life, that calms me. I'd planned everything carefully, checked the weather, mapped out a good trail, and packed all the essentials. It was just supposed to be a solo trip, one where I could get some much-needed peace and maybe a little adventure. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when I arrived at the campsite. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple, and the air felt crisp, like it was preparing for the cool night ahead. I parked my car at the edge of the small forest clearing, grabbed my gear, and set off on foot. I'd chosen a remote spot a few miles away from the main trail to set up camp. The further out I went, the more I felt disconnected from the rest of the world, and that's exactly what I wanted. The ground was soft and spongy beneath my boots, and the scent of pine filled the air. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sound of a stream trickled somewhere to my left. It felt like the perfect place to unwind and clear my mind. I hiked for about an hour before I reached the spot I had in mind. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a view of the mountains off in the distance. A perfect spot to set up my tent, make a fire, and enjoy the solitude. I unpacked my gear, quickly set up my tent, and built a small fire pit with the dry wood I had gathered. The fire crackled to life as I added the last few pieces of wood, and the warmth from the flames made the cool evening air feel a bit more bearable. I sat down on a rock near the fire, pulling out my camping stove to make some dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just freeze-dried pasta, but it tasted amazing after the long hike. As the sky darkened, I watched the stars begin to emerge, one by one. It was incredibly peaceful out here, with only the sound of the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I settled back against a tree, staring up at the night sky. There were no city lights to drown out the stars, and for a moment, it felt like I was the only person left in the world. I finished my dinner and stowed everything away before grabbing my flashlight to check on the perimeter of my campsite. I was paranoid about animals, mainly bears or coyotes, but it wasn't like I could afford to let my guard down. I made a quick loop around the clearing, checking to make sure the food was secured, the fire wasn't too large, and nothing unusual was happening. Everything seemed fine, so I headed back to my tent and crawled inside. The fire outside flickered through the thin walls of the tent, casting long shadows that danced on the fabric. It was a long night. As I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to get some rest, I kept hearing strange noises outside. The wind had picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak, but there were other sounds. Faint rustling in the bushes, almost like something was moving around the campsite. It could have been a deer, or a raccoon, or any number of animals, but every time I heard it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, something watching. I didn't get much sleep that night, tossing and turning every time a branch snapped or a twig broke nearby. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves. But when I peeked outside, there was nothing there, just the shadows of the trees, stretching long and dark in the firelight. I figured I was just being paranoid. The wilderness was full of sounds, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. Still, I didn't feel completely at ease. The next morning, I woke up with the first light of dawn, feeling groggy and unrest. I crawled out of my tent, stretching as I took in the fresh mountain air. The fire was nothing but a few glowing embers now, and the forest around me looked peaceful once again. I made some coffee and sat by the fire, hoping to shake off the unease from the previous night. I was determined to make the most of the day. I decided to go for a hike to explore the area further. The trail I had planned to take wound through dense forest and alongside the stream I had heard the night before. It was a beautiful route, with the sun filtering through the trees and casting dappled light on the path. I felt a bit more relaxed as I walked, but the thought of whatever had been lurking around my campsite still gnawed at the back of my mind. As I hiked deeper into the woods, I began to notice something strange. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds, squirrels, the rustling of leaves, had all but disappeared. The forest was eerily quiet, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread settle over me. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling, but it only grew stronger the further I went. I came to a small clearing by the stream, where I decided to stop and rest for a bit. The water was clear, and I could hear the sound of it tumbling over rocks, but something about the place felt off. The trees around the clearing were strangely spaced, as though they had been deliberately planted that way. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. I sat down on a large rock by the water's edge, sipping from my water bottle. As I looked around, I noticed something strange in the distance, a flash of movement. It was too quick to make out clearly, but it looked like something large and dark darting between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, instinctively reaching for my knife. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all I had on me. I waited, straining my ears for any sound, but the forest remained unervingly quiet. After what felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath and forced myself to turn away from the clearing, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I wasn't alone out here. There were plenty of animals, maybe even people, out in the woods. It wasn't strange to see movement from a distance. Still, the thought of whatever I'd seen lingered in my mind as I began the long trek back to my camp. When I returned to my campsite, everything seemed fine. The tent was still where I had left it, and there were no signs of anything having disturbed my gear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. I sat down on a log near the fire pit, trying to calm my nerves. That night, I decided to stay up late. I wasn't sure why, but I had a strong feeling that I wasn't going to be able to sleep. The air was cold, and the wind had picked up again, rustling the trees and creating eerie sounds that made it feel like something was moving through the woods. I kept checking the perimeter of the campsite, making sure everything was secure. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally saw it. I had just finished checking the campfire when I noticed a shape in the distance, moving between the trees. It was large, darker than the shadows, and it seemed to be walking upright. My heart started to race. Whatever it wasn't an animal. It was too big, too deliberate in its movement. I froze, trying not to make a sound as I watched it move. It was just outside the range of my firelight, but I could make out the outline of it. Tall and broad-shouldered, with long arms swinging as it walked. It didn't seem to notice me, and after what felt like forever, it disappeared into the trees. My mind was racing. I knew it couldn't be a person. It didn't make sense for anyone to be out here this far in the wilderness. But whatever it was large and deliberate. I decided I had to leave. I wasn't going to risk staying in a place where I didn't feel safe anymore. The next morning, I packed up my gear in a rush. I didn't even bother with breakfast or taking my time. I was on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest around me seemed quiet, but every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I hurriedly made my way back to the car, keeping an eye on the trees and the underbrush as I walked. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted. I didn't stop to look back as I drove away, heading back towards civilization. The whole experience felt like a nightmare I couldn't shake. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, knowing I would never come back to that place. It's been weeks since I left, and I still don't know what I saw that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I know it wasn't. I don't know if it was an animal, a person, or something else entirely, but I do know one thing: I'm never camping alone again. I had always been a fan of camping. The simplicity of it, the fresh air, the crackling of the campfire, and the quiet serenity that surrounded me when I left the hustle and bustle behind. This trip, though, was different. I had planned it for weeks, chosen a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from the crowds of the usual campsites. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me and nature, but that's not how things turned out. I'd arrived at the campsite early in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip low. It was a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush, with a stream running through the edge of the camp. Perfect, I thought. I'd spent the first hour setting up my tent and making sure everything was in place. I wanted to settle in before nightfall, so I took my time with every little task, making sure everything was just right. By the time I had my tent up and gear arranged, the sun was nearly gone, and the forest was already darkening. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, and the air was starting to feel cooler. I built a small fire, more for warmth than for light. The camp was isolated, with no one around for miles, but the fire would provide some comfort, some sense of safety in the growing darkness. I sat back and stared into the flames, my mind wandering. It's funny how you can feel completely alone in a place like this, but at the same time, you're surrounded by life. The sounds of the forest were all around: rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. Most people would find it calming, but there was something unsettling about the quiet, too. It was as though the forest was alive with secrets, just waiting to reveal them. As the fire crackled, I started to feel the weight of the solitude. My only company was the occasional bird flying by or the distant sound of a deer moving through the underbrush. I could hear the wind picking up a little, the trees swaying slightly as it moved through them. The feeling of being watched crept over me, but I dismissed it quickly. Just the forest, I told myself. Nothing more. The evening passed slowly. I ate a quick meal, enjoyed the warmth of the fire, and watched the stars begin to twinkle above. There was something soothing about the vastness of the night sky, the way it stretched endlessly above me. I had always loved the stars, but tonight, they felt different, distant, cold, almost indifferent to my small existence. As the night grew deeper, I finally crawled into my tent. It was a good-sized tent, big enough for me to sit up in comfortably. I settled into my sleeping bag, the crackling fire still faintly audible outside. I had a flashlight beside me, just in case, but I wasn't particularly worried. I had camped alone before, and nothing had ever happened. But that night was different. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling of leaves, like something or someone was moving slowly around the perimeter of my camp. My heart skipped a beat. I lay completely still, listening intently, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. It was too deliberate, too careful. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers trembling slightly. The rustling continued, closer now, just outside the tent. I held my breath, praying it was just a raccoon or some other small animal, but the movement was unmistakable. Something was circling my camp, something that knew I was here. I waited for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. I tried to reassure myself, telling myself it was nothing, but that didn't stop the feeling of dread creeping up my spine, the way my heart thudded painfully in my chest. Then, without warning, a twig snapped sharply underfoot. It was right outside my tent. I froze. My flashlight flickered nervously in my hand as I slowly, very slowly, turned it on, aiming it towards the flap of the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the trees and underbrush just beyond the tent. But I could still feel it, the presence, just beyond my vision. My mind raced. Could just be someone else camping nearby, right? Maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost, or a ranger doing a check. That would make sense. But why wouldn't they call out? Why weren't they talking? I felt the heavy silence pressing in, and my mind started to spiral. I listened again. No sounds now, nothing but the steady beat of my heart and the occasional crack of a branch in the wind. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't shake the sensation that whatever it was still out there, waiting, watching. I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent slightly and peer outside. The beam of the flashlight swept over the ground, the trees, and the darkened space beyond. The light fell on nothing, just the quiet emptiness of the forest. But there was something else. The air was still too still. Even the wind had stopped. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper of something moving just outside the light. I pulled my head back into the tent, heart pounding. Whatever it was, it wasn't an animal. I couldn't say why, but I knew. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every rustle, every snap of a branch, every gust of wind had me wide awake, my eyes darting to the tent flap, my hand clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. I didn't dare go out. I didn't even dare make a sound. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I knew I had to leave. I wasn't sure what had been out there, or why it had been circling my camp, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I packed up my gear quickly, keeping my eyes darting around the camp, but there was nothing. No sign of whoever or whatever had been watching me. I made my way back to my car as fast as I could, the forest still and silent around me. Once I was safely in the car and the engine started, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being followed never left me, not even as I reached the edge of the forest and saw the familiar roads ahead. I couldn't shake the sense that something had been out there in the dark, just beyond the edge of my vision, and I wasn't sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back to that spot. Whatever had been out there, it was better left undisturbed. It had been years since I'd gone camping in the deep woods. After all, I'd spent so much time in the outdoors growing up that I figured a weekend getaway would be refreshing. I'd planned this trip with the intention of getting away from the noise and pressure of everyday life, hoping to rediscover the peace I once found in nature. But little did I know, the woods would give me more than I bargained for. I drove to a secluded spot on the edge of the forest, the kind of place you only find if you're willing to put in the effort. I knew the area well, but it had been a long time since I'd last been there. The quiet was almost oppressive, the trees so thick they blocked out most of the sky. I parked my car at a small trailhead, gathering my gear and checking that everything was in order before I set off. The trail was familiar, but there was a strange feeling in the air. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds, maybe the rustling of animals in the underbrush, but all I heard was the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the forest floor. I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself it was just the change in surroundings. The hike to my campsite was about a mile, maybe a little more. It was a simple, no-frills campsite, just a clearing by a stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. I remembered how much I used to enjoy the solitude of this place, but today, it felt different. There was an unfamiliar weight in the air, something that made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. When I arrived, the campsite looked just like I remembered it. A small clearing surrounded by trees with the gentle flow of a stream nearby. I wasted no time setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and making sure everything was ready for the night. As I sat down on a nearby rock, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't that I heard anything, but the stillness around me felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. I shook it off, figuring I was just being paranoid. The sunset was beautiful, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I watched the sky turn orange and purple, and for a brief moment, I felt at peace. As the light faded and darkness settled in, I started the fire. The crackling flames warmed me as I sat by the campfire, eating a small meal I'd packed. The sound of the fire was comforting, a reminder of the simpler days when I used to come out here for weeks at a time, escaping the world. But tonight, even the fire didn't feel like enough to ease the tension I felt. I settled into my tent, my only company the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I tried to sleep, but every little noise outside kept pulling me back to the waking world. It was like something was moving around the campsite, just out of sight. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps some small animal. But as the night wore on, the noises seemed to grow more deliberate, more intentional. There was a rustle near the edge of the clearing. I tensed, staring into the darkness. The sound stopped for a moment, and then came again, closer this time. My heart began to race as I sat up, gripping the flashlight by my side. I knew the woods could be unpredictable, but this felt wrong. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the campsite. There was nothing unusual at first, just the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. But then I saw it, a set of footprints, fresh, almost too fresh, leading from the tree line into the clearing. They weren't human footprints, not entirely. They were larger than normal human footprints. The toes were wide and splayed, and the edges of the prints were deeper than they should have been for someone walking on soft ground. My pulse quickened. I scanned the area around me, my flashlight flickering in the unsettling silence. I was used to hearing animals at night, but there was nothing now, just the sound of my own breathing. I moved back toward my tent, feeling exposed in the middle of the clearing. The strange footprints continued for a few paces before they vanished into the trees. I spent the rest of the night in a fitful sleep, constantly waking up at the slightest sound. By morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the forest. I packed up my things quickly, eager to leave the campsite behind, but something told me I wasn't out of danger yet. The trail back to my car seemed longer than it had been the day before. Every step felt heavier, and the forest around me seemed to be closing in. I didn't hear any birds, no squirrels chattering in the trees. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. As I reached the final stretch of trail, I heard it, footsteps behind me, crunching softly on the forest floor. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to turn around, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I had to keep moving, had to get out of there. I picked up the pace, my mind racing. What was following me? Who or what had left those strange footprints? I didn't know, but I couldn't take any chances. I kept walking faster, the footsteps behind me matching my pace, never growing closer, but never disappearing either. When I finally saw the edge of the forest, I pushed myself harder. My car was just a few hundred yards away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me. It was only when I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, that the footsteps stopped. I looked around, but there was no one there. No sign of anything that could have been following me. The air was still, the forest just as silent as it had been when I first arrived. My heart was still racing, but I didn't wait to second-guess myself. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine, speeding away from the woods as fast as I could. The rest of the drive back to town was uneventful. I didn't stop to look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that had followed me the whole way out of those woods. I never returned to that spot. The memory of that night stayed with me for a long time, and the thought of those strange footprints still sends a shiver down my spine. The woods weren't the peaceful retreat I remembered. They were something else entirely, something dark and unsettling. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I'm not so sure. Maybe there's something in those woods, something that doesn't want to be found. Either way, I learned my lesson. Some places are better left untouched, and sometimes it's better to leave the woods behind. I've always enjoyed camping. It's something about the calm of nature that helps me unwind. The sound of a crackling fire, and the smell of pine trees that always made the outdoors feel like a second home. I'd been on solo camping trips before, but this one was different. I had heard rumors about the area I was heading into, about strange things happening in the woods, but I didn't think much of them. People talk, right? Besides, I wasn't the type to get scared easily. I packed my gear into my truck the day before, making sure I had everything. Tent, sleeping bag, a couple of knives, a flashlight, water bottles, food for a few days, and my trusty camping stove. I even brought a map just in case, but I wasn't expecting to need it. The area I was headed to was one of the quieter spots in the woods, a place far from the main trails, so it wasn't crowded with tourists. That's exactly why I chose it. The drive there was beautiful. The roads wound through thick trees, with the sun shining through the branches and casting long shadows on the ground. It felt peaceful, like I was heading to a secluded paradise. The place was about 3 hours from where I lived, deep enough into the wilderness that cell service was spotty, but not remote enough that it felt unsafe. Or so I thought. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun started dipping lower in the sky. I found a small clearing near a stream, the perfect spot for setting up my tent. There were no signs of anyone else being around, which was exactly what I wanted. After unloading my gear and setting up camp, I started a fire, enjoying the warmth as the air began to cool. The sound of the stream and the crackling of the fire were the only noises I could hear. As the night deepened, I ate some food and took in the stillness around me. There was something oddly peaceful about it all, but also a little unsettling. The forest was so quiet, like it was holding its breath. I had heard stories from other campers about strange things happening in these woods, but I didn't believe in those sorts of things. I figured it was just people trying to scare each other. The sky darkened, and the moon began to rise. I threw another log on the fire and settled back in my chair, watching the flames flicker. That's when I heard it. First, it was faint, a soft rustling noise, like something moving through the leaves. I thought it was just a squirrel or maybe a deer, but then it got louder. It sounded more deliberate, almost like something was walking. My eyes scanned the trees, but I didn't see anything. My heart started to beat faster. The noise stopped for a moment, and I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my backpack, and started shining it around. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything unusual. No movement, no animals. I felt silly, like I was just overreacting. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I sat back down, trying to ignore the strange sensation crawling up my spine. But then, Just as I was about to get comfortable again, I heard something else. Footsteps. Clear, deliberate footsteps crunching in the dry leaves. I whipped the flashlight around, but once again, there was nothing. No figure, no animal, just the faintest rustling, like something was moving just beyond the edge of the light. I was beginning to feel uneasy. I checked my watch. It was nearly 10 p.m. I had a decision to make. Stay out here and deal with whatever it was, or pack up and leave. The logical part of me said it was just an animal, but something about it didn't feel right. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. There was no reason to panic. I was a seasoned camper. I tried to settle back in, focusing on the fire, when I heard the sound again, much closer this time. I froze. This time, there was no denying it. Something was out there, moving around my campsite. I slowly reached for my knife, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder. There was no animal that made a sound like this. I could feel it in my gut. This wasn't a normal night in the woods. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack of a branch, and I couldn't help but jump. The noise was followed by a low, soft growl. I froze, my mind racing. It didn't sound like an animal I knew. It was too human. Something about it felt unnatural, like it was trying to imitate an animal but couldn't quite get it right. My breathing grew shallow, and my eyes darted around the dark woods. I heard movement again, much closer this time, and I could feel the panic starting to rise. Was it a person? Was someone trying to mess with me? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to sit there and find out. I grabbed my pack and shoved everything I could into it. I wasn't about to stick around to see what it was. As I hurried to break down my camp, the footsteps grew louder and closer, and the growl, that low, guttural sound, echoed through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I had to leave. But as I packed up, I heard something worse. Silence. Complete and utter silence. The noises had stopped. The air was thick with it, and my heart hammered in my chest. I was trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my backpack. I stood up, ready to leave, when the noise returned. Faster this time, almost like it was charging at me. I spun around, my flashlight in hand, but I saw nothing, only darkness. Then, through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing still. It was just a shape, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I couldn't make out any details, but it felt wrong. It didn't belong there. The figure stayed motionless, and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my bag and ran, my heart racing as I sprinted down the trail. Branches slapped against my face, and I barely managed to avoid tripping over the uneven ground. Every step felt like an eternity as I pushed myself to go faster. I ran without looking back, only stopping when I reached the truck, my chest heaving as I fumbled for the keys. The woods were silent now, too silent, but I didn't care. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I didn't know what had been out there or who or what had been watching me, but I didn't need to know. All I knew was that I wasn't going back. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the campsite behind. As I drove through the winding roads, I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me. But no matter how fast I drove, the image of that figure, standing motionless in the dark woods, wouldn't leave my mind. By the time I reached the main road, I had convinced myself that it had all been my imagination. Maybe it was just an animal, or perhaps I had been too tired, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I had experienced something in those woods that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't gonna try. I'd come looking for peace and solitude, but what I found was far from that. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I was certain I never wanted to find out again. The woods had a way of hiding things, things you didn't want to see, things you couldn't understand. And sometimes it's better to walk away than to dig too deep. That night, I walked away and I never looked back. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of the woods. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, finally taking some time off to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life. The campsite I chose was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest trail, a place I had researched thoroughly before setting off. It was secluded and tranquil, just the kind of place I needed to reset. I arrived at the site late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I unpacked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, and set up camp near a small stream. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled my lungs with each breath. Everything felt right. I was used to the outdoors, having camped in the woods countless times, but there was something about this spot that felt different. Maybe it was the silence. There was no wind, no distant hum of a highway, no sound of animals moving through the brush, just the sound of water flowing gently in the stream. I built a small fire, set up my chair beside it, and let the warmth seep into my bones. I cooked a simple meal, enjoying the solitude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep blue, and the stars began to twinkle above. It was one of those nights where the sky seemed endless, like the universe was just within reach. As the fire crackled, I noticed something odd, a sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of trees or the distant hoot of an owl. It was a low, almost inaudible noise coming from the direction of the stream. At first, I brushed it off as the wind, though there was no breeze. But the sound persisted, a faint scraping noise followed by a soft thud. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked cautiously toward the stream. My mind raced. Maybe it was a rock shifting in the water, or perhaps an animal moving through the brush. But the closer I got to the water, the more unsettled I became. The sound was clearer now, like something heavy dragging against the earth. I stopped at the edge of the stream, shining my flashlight across the rocks and trees. Nothing, just shadows and the occasional flicker of my light against the water. I let out a sigh of relief, chalking it up to nerves. It was getting late, and I was probably just tired. I turned to head back to the fire. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, near where the stream curved out of sight, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally so, and appeared to be watching me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to run, but something in the pit of my stomach told me to stay still. The figure didn't move. It was just there, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. My heart rate didn't slow as I walked back to the fire. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I sat down in my chair and tried to focus on the flames, but the crackling of the fire didn't soothe me like it usually did. Every rustle in the trees, every shift in the air, felt amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stayed up for a few hours, watching the fire burn down to embers, too uneasy to sleep but too exhausted to leave. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy, and I decided to turn in for the night. The wind had picked up slightly, and the trees began to sway, creaking under the pressure. I zipped up my tent and crawled into my sleeping bag, the sound of the wind making the nylon fabric of the tent flap softly. I must have drifted off to sleep, though it wasn't restful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing by the trees. It felt like I wasn't alone, like there was someone or something waiting outside, just beyond the fabric of the tent. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder. A steady, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps in the dirt. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be circling my tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the shift of dirt, but the figure of the person, or whatever it was, never made a sound beyond the steps. I pressed my ear to the fabric of the tent, straining to hear any other movement. The footsteps stopped suddenly. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow. Should I check outside? Should I wait it out? Just as I was about to make up my mind, there was a loud, sudden crash. Something heavy slammed into the side of my tent. My heart stopped. I grabbed the nearest object, my flashlight, and pressed my back against the far corner of the tent. The sounds outside grew more frantic, more desperate. It was like someone or something was trying to get in. I didn't dare move. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, making you doubt your own thoughts. I waited a long time, frozen in the darkness of my tent. Eventually, the silence became too much to bear. I unzipped the tent ever so slowly, trying not to make a sound. The night air hit me with a sudden chill as I crept outside, flashlight in hand. The campfire was long gone, reduced to nothing more than a few smoldering embers. I scanned the area around me, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints or broken branches. But then, I noticed something. My gear, the things I had left out earlier, was now disturbed. My backpack was moved a few feet from where I'd left it, and my cooking tools were scattered across the ground, as though someone had rummaged through them. Panic surged through me. Whoever or whatever had been outside my tent was still here, close. I backed away from the mess, trying not to make any noise, when I heard it again. A faint rustling from behind me. I spun around, but this time, the figure I had seen earlier was standing right in front of me, blocking the path to the trees. Its form was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too long for any human body. I couldn't make out much detail in the darkness, but the shape was unmistakable. It wasn't human. My first instinct was to run, but I knew there was no way I'd outrun whatever this thing was. I took a deep breath, my mind racing for a plan. Slowly, I began to move toward my tent, trying to keep my eyes on the figure without looking like I was panicking. Every step felt like an eternity. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its attention fixed on me. I reached my tent and grabbed my phone from my pack, only to realize there was no signal. The woods were too far from any network tower. My only chance was to make it to my car, which was parked about a half-mile away. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and headed toward the path. I kept moving, my heart racing, but the figure didn't follow. Every so often, I glanced back, half expecting to see it looming in the trees, but it remained still. I had no idea what this thing wanted, but I was done being its target. I kept moving faster, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots growing louder in the stillness of the woods. Eventually, I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, barely able to steady my hands as I unlocked the door and climbed inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gear into drive, speeding out of the campgrounds without a second glance. As I drove away, I felt the weight of the fear lifting off me, but there was a part of me that still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods. What had that thing wanted? Why had it followed me? And more importantly, would it come after me again? I had always loved camping. There was something about the stillness of the wilderness that brought a sense of peace, a quiet I couldn't find anywhere else. When my friend suggested we head out to a remote part of the forest, I didn't hesitate. It was going to be an adventure, a break from everything, the perfect opportunity to escape the stresses of daily life and just enjoy nature. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trees. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and dense with towering pines and dense undergrowth. There was a small creek running nearby, its water bubbling softly over rocks, creating a soothing soundtrack to the evening. We set up camp quickly, the familiar routine of unloading gear and pitching tents feeling comforting. Felt like every other camping trip I'd been on. After dinner, we sat around the campfire. The flames danced, crackling in the evening air. We joked, laughed, and shared stories, the flickering light casting shadows on our faces. The forest around us felt alive, but in a way that was calming, not threatening. I leaned back against a tree, staring up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt perfect. But that night, something was off. I couldn't place it at first. It was subtle, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The night was too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl were absent. It was as if the entire forest had gone still, holding its breath. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, I'd been in the woods countless times, and I'd never had anything unusual happen. But as the night wore on, the feeling grew stronger, more unsettling. At some point, I found myself alone at the edge of the camp, staring into the dark expanse of trees. The firelight barely reached past the perimeter of our campsite, leaving the woods in an impenetrable blackness. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the cold beginning to seep through my clothes. It wasn't the temperature that had me on edge. It was the silence, the unnatural stillness of the woods. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a rustle, a soft shuffling sound from deep in the trees. I paused, straining to hear, but the sound didn't come again. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other small creature, moving through the underbrush. It was normal, nothing to worry about. But then, it came again, louder this time. A deliberate step, another rustle. Something or someone was out there. My heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath quickened. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth, but my eyes kept flicking back to the darkness, where the sound had come from. It was coming closer that I stood up, my legs unsteady, unsure if I should call out to my friends or stay silent. Maybe it was just an animal, but what if it wasn't? What if it was something more, something human? The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I knew the area wasn't near any trails, and it was far from any other campsites. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. The rustling continued, getting closer and closer, and I couldn't help myself. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the dark woods. The beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating nothing but trees and shrubs. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I called out to my friends, my voice shaking, but there was no response. Maybe they were asleep, or maybe they hadn't heard me over the sound of the fire. Couldn't wait. I had to do something. I stepped forward, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots the only sound breaking the silence. As I walked toward the source of the noise, I kept the flashlight in front of me, scanning the trees. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the rustling, louder than anything else. Every step felt heavy, my feet unwilling to move any faster. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. The woods were still. For a moment, I felt foolish, wondering if I'd just been imagining things. But then I heard it again. A snap of a twig, a shuffle of feet. And this time it was close. Too close. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, my hand trembling. The beam caught a movement in the trees, a shadow slipping between the trunks. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but all I could focus on was the shape in the dark. It was human-shaped, but it didn't seem to move like a person. It was slow, deliberate, as if it knew I was watching but didn't care. My stomach dropped. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I shout? But before I could decide, the figure disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I should have gone back to the camp, but some strange instinct, kept me rooted to the spot. I waited, listening for any other sounds, any sign that the figure was still out there. But there was nothing, only the silence. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the spot where I'd seen the figure. I made my way back to the campsite as quietly as I could, my legs shaking with every step. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw my friends, still sitting by the fire, oblivious to everything that had just happened. I didn't mention what I'd seen. I couldn't bring myself to. What if they thought I was crazy? What if they dismissed it as nothing? So, I sat down trying to act normal, but the tension in my body wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we weren't alone. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow moving between the trees. The sound of twigs snapping echoed in my mind, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the dark. Morning came, but I didn't feel any better. If anything, the dread that had settled in my chest the night before was even stronger. I wanted to leave. I wanted to pack up and get out of there. But I couldn't bring myself to tell my friends. I didn't want to seem paranoid. So, we spent the day hiking and exploring the woods, trying to push the fear to the back of my mind. But as the sun began to set again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. We weren't alone. That night, I stayed closer to the campfire, keeping an eye on the woods. Every snap of a branch made my heart race. I kept the flashlight within reach, ready to shine it into the dark at a moment's notice. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the unease never left me. I was relieved when morning finally came, and we packed up and headed back to the car. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance at the forest one last time, my heart still racing. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a person, maybe it was an animal, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I do know this: I'll never go camping in that part of the woods again. And every time I find myself in the woods now, that feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the trees, always follows me. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just me, the quiet woods, and the sound of nature. A break from everything: work, phone calls, the noise of the city. I've always been someone who enjoyed getting away from the chaos. So I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, and a couple of cans of food, and headed to a remote spot I'd been to before. There was a lake nearby, nestled in a valley between two hills. It was peaceful and the perfect place to just clear my mind. The sun was still high when I arrived, casting long shadows across the landscape. It felt good to step away from the car, inhale the fresh air, and listen to the breeze rustling the leaves. I unpacked my gear, set up the tent, and started a small fire. The fire crackled as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep orange glow over the surrounding trees. As darkness crept in, I settled near the fire. I'd always loved the quiet of the wilderness at night. It was different from the city noise that never stopped. Here, it was the sound of wind, rustling branches, and the occasional distant call of an animal. I grabbed a can of beans, opened it with my trusty can opener, and spooned some into a pot over the fire. The night was calm, almost too calm. As I ate, I noticed something odd. There was no sound from the usual night critters, the rustling of raccoons, the chirp of crickets, or even the hoot of an owl. It was like the whole forest had gone silent, like it was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just an unusually quiet night. The breeze picked up, making the flames dance, and I added a few more branches to the fire. The crackling sound was the only thing that filled the air. I finished my meal, cleaned up my pot, and sat back, staring into the fire. It was peaceful, but there was something unsettling about the silence. Then the silence was broken by a sound, faint at first, like something moving through the underbrush. It was soft, almost like footsteps, but there was no rustling of leaves or the typical sound of an animal. Just a slow, deliberate sound that I couldn't quite place. I stood up, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the noise. The crackling of the fire made it hard to hear, but the sound persisted. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed a flashlight from my backpack and clicked it on, sweeping it around the campsite. Nothing. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a large bird. I sat back down, trying to shake the feeling of unease that crept over me. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that I was just alone in the woods, and that it wasn't unusual to hear strange noises at night. But the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It felt heavier, like the air had thickened. The fire crackled, and I reached for a stick to poke at it, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Then, there was another sound, louder this time. A crack, like a twig breaking underfoot. This time, it came from just beyond the edge of the firelight. I froze. I couldn't see anything, but my senses were on high alert. I stood up slowly, my heart racing. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the dark woods around me with my flashlight. The beam danced over trees and bushes, but there was nothing out of place. The wind shifted again, and with it, the eerie quiet returned. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but I tried to shake it off. I couldn't let my nerves get the better of me. I'd been camping out here plenty of times before and had never felt like this. I decided to check the area around the campsite just to make sure everything was all right. I grabbed a stick from the ground and held it in my hand as I stepped carefully into the dark woods, keeping my flashlight low to the ground to avoid shining it on anything that might make noise. My breath was shallow, and my footsteps felt louder than they should have been. The underbrush was thick, but the path was clear enough to follow. I walked for a few minutes, trying to keep my mind from racing. I had to remind myself that I was just being paranoid. It was just a weird night, nothing more. But then, as I turned a corner around a cluster of trees, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, just a few feet ahead, was something that looked out of place. It wasn't a person, but it wasn't like any animal I'd seen before. It was large, too large for a deer, and it moved too quickly, too smoothly. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight's beam fell on it for just a second, enough to make out a strange shape, but it was gone before I could process what I was seeing. I immediately stepped back, my pulse quickening. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want to find out. The air felt thick and heavy, and I realized I was standing in complete darkness. I had lost the beam of my flashlight in the shock of what I'd just seen. I hurried back to my campsite, my breath shallow and my mind racing. Whatever it wasn't normal, and it wasn't something I wanted to face. When I reached the fire, I felt a slight sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Something wasn't right. The fire, which had been burning brightly just moments ago, was now flickering and weak, as if the air itself was sucking the heat from it. I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, the darkened shadows beyond the firelight. The noise, those footsteps were back. This time they were closer. I grabbed my gear, stuffing it all into my bag as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there wasn't something I wanted to meet. I turned to run, but the ground seemed to shift under my feet. The dark woods around me felt like they were closing in, as though the trees themselves were watching me. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I stumbled, tripping over branches, my heart hammering in my chest. Every step felt like it was leading me deeper into something I didn't understand. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I broke through the underbrush and into a small clearing. I saw the outline of the lake in the distance, the water reflecting the dim light of the moon. The clearing was safe. For now, I was out of the woods. I didn't know what had been following me, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I ran for the car, my heart racing and my mind spinning, desperately trying to push away the feeling of being watched. I didn't stop running until I reached the road and found the safety of my car. I drove for hours, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting something to be there, but there was nothing. I never went back to that place. To this day, I can't explain what happened or what I saw that night. All I know is that it was real. Whatever it was out there in the woods watching. And I'll never forget that feeling of being so far away from safety, with nowhere to run but into the dark. But I made it out. That's the only thing that matters. I've always enjoyed camping. Just me, the woods, and the sound of nature. There's something so peaceful about it, especially when you've been cooped up in the city for too long. This trip was supposed to be no different. I was on a solo camping adventure, eager to escape the daily grind. I had my gear, a good map, and plenty of food, so it was just about finding the perfect spot to relax for a few days. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. It wasn't too far from the nearest town, but far enough to feel isolated. The forest here was dense, with towering trees and thick underbrush. The smell of pine filled the air, and the only sound was the occasional bird call and the rustle of leaves underfoot. I was in my element. I started walking along the trail, feeling the familiar weight of my backpack and the crunch of dirt beneath my boots. The trail wasn't difficult, but it wasn't the easiest either. I wanted to find a spot that wasn't too crowded, so I kept moving, pushing deeper into the woods. After about an hour of hiking, I found a small clearing next to a stream, with a few rocks nearby that would make a good seat. It was quiet, and the sound of running water was soothing. Perfect. I set up camp, pitching my tent and organizing my gear. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I lit a fire with my flint, watching the flames dance and crackle. The night was starting to settle in, and I couldn't have asked for better weather. It wasn't too cold, and the stars were starting to appear as the sky darkened. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant rustling in the brush. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then the sound came again, closer this time. It was too deliberate to be an animal. Something was moving through the woods, and it wasn't the usual scurrying of wildlife. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around my campsite. Nothing. The forest was still. The fire crackled, and the night felt peaceful again. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I tried to shake off the unease and went about preparing my dinner, boiling some water for soup. I kept the fire burning, its warmth providing a sense of security, but the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone refused to leave. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move in the shadows just beyond the firelight. By the time I finished eating, the sky had turned completely dark, and the temperature was starting to drop. I decided to crawl into my tent, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head. I zipped up the door, making sure my gear was secure, and settled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest at night, the wind in the trees, the distant chirping of insects, started to lull me into a light sleep. That's when I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking around my campsite. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to grab my knife, but it was a few feet away, just out of reach. I held my breath, straining to hear any more sounds. The footsteps stopped, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I lay perfectly still, listening to every rustle, every crack of a twig. But nothing came after that. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already up, shining brightly through the trees. My head was a little foggy from the interrupted sleep, but I felt like I had to get out of that campsite. The eerie feeling hadn't gone away, and I was no longer sure if I wanted to be alone in the woods. I packed up my gear quickly, ready to head back to the trailhead. As I was stuffing my tent into its bag, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the edge of my camp. They weren't animal prints, but human-sized, though they seemed odd. They were almost too perfect, as if someone had been walking around my tent in a circle. I was starting to feel really uneasy now. I picked up my backpack and started hiking back down the trail, quickening my pace. Every step I took seemed to make the woods feel more suffocating, more alive with hidden dangers. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. It was mid-morning by the time I reached the main trail again, and the sun was high in the sky, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. The feeling clung to me like a shadow. I made it back to the parking lot without incident, but as I loaded my gear into my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the back window of my car, someone had written something in the dirt. The message was simple but terrifying. "I see you." I didn't wait around to figure out who had done it. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove off, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was back in town, and even then, I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. But when I told the local rangers about what happened, they just nodded knowingly. Apparently, that area had seen a few strange incidents over the years. Lost hikers, odd encounters, and people who felt like they were being followed but couldn't explain why. They didn't seem concerned, though. They said it was likely just other hikers or some pranksters, though the message on my car left them silent for a moment. I wasn't convinced. I still had no idea who had been out there with me, or why they were watching me so closely. But I did know one thing. I wouldn't be camping in that area again. The woods were beautiful, but they held secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. It's been months since that trip, and I've been back to other campsites, but the unease never fully left me. Every rustling sound, every twig snapping in the night, reminds me of that lonely night in the woods. But the one thing I can hold on to, the thing that comforts me, is that I made it out. It was a close call, and I'll never know who or what was out there with me, but I survived. And in the end, that's all that matters. I learned to trust my instincts, to never ignore that creeping feeling that something isn't right. Some experiences change you, and that camping trip was one of them. I had always been an avid camper, the kind of person who loved getting lost in the wilderness, far away from the chaos of the world. The crisp air, the sound of leaves rustling, and the quiet hum of nature were my escape. It was on one such camping trip that I experienced something I can't explain. It started out like any other camping trip. I packed my gear, made sure I had everything from food to a first aid kit, and headed into the woods alone. I had done this countless times before, so I knew what I was doing. The plan was simple: hike to a remote spot, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights enjoying nature in peace. No distractions, just me and the forest. The hike was beautiful. The trees were tall, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped high above, and the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. The path was familiar, but there was something different this time. It wasn't the path that was off, but the feeling in the air. There was an odd stillness to it, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. But I pushed it out of my mind. Maybe I was just tired or overly cautious, I thought. By the time I reached my chosen spot, the sun had begun to set. I set up my tent quickly, not wanting to be caught in the dark. The fire pit was still in decent shape from previous campers, so I gathered some dry wood, lit the fire, and sat back to enjoy the flames. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and the fire was a welcome source of warmth. The shadows cast by the flames danced across the trees, creating eerie shapes that seemed to move and change. It was peaceful at first, but the quiet began to feel unnerving. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, though I was alone in the woods. I ignored it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I continued to stare into the fire, occasionally glancing around, just to reassure myself that I was still alone. But then I heard it, a rustle in the bushes, just outside the ring of firelight. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. I froze, listening intently. The rustling continued, then stopped. I waited, staring into the darkness, trying to make out any shape or movement. But there was nothing. The woods were quiet again, almost too quiet. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I reached for my flashlight, keeping it tucked in my jacket for emergencies. With a deep breath, I grabbed it, turned it on, and swept it across the clearing. Nothing. The beam of light hit only the trees and the ground. There were no signs of movement, no eyes reflecting in the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a wild animal. But the sound came again, this time from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the dark. Nothing. I felt stupid for getting so worked up. It was just an animal. I reassured myself as I returned to the fire, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then the temperature seemed to drop even further. The fire didn't seem as warm as it had a few minutes ago. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my gut. The night felt heavier now, like the darkness was pressing in on me. I glanced around again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. A shape barely visible in the shadows, just outside the range of the firelight. It was too quick to identify, but it was there. My heart began to race again. What was it? An animal? Person? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Something or someone was out there. I stood up, grabbed my knife from my pack, and stood beside the fire, my back stiff with tension. Couldn't let my guard down, not now. The forest was no longer a peaceful place to me. It was a labyrinth of shadows, and I was trapped in the middle of it. The rustling came again, and this time it was right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight in my hand trembling. There was nothing there, nothing at all. I took a step back, my mind racing. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought I could hear it over the sound of the wind in the trees. I felt trapped, cornered by something I couldn't see, something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my things, my backpack, my sleeping bag, and decided to leave. I wasn't going to stay here any longer, not with whatever was out there. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice in my head, my own voice, telling me to stop. "Don't go," it whispered. I ignored it and bolted. My feet thudded on the soft ground as I ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away from that campsite, away from whatever was out there in the darkness. The night swallowed me whole, but I kept running. I didn't look back, not even once. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the trees, and for a moment, I felt like I was being chased, though I couldn't hear anything behind me. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming, but I couldn't stop. I just kept running. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing. I collapsed to the ground, my chest heaving with exhaustion. I was far from the campsite now, but I was too afraid to move further. My mind was spinning. Was I just imagining it all? Was it an animal? Person? My imagination had been running wild, or so I tried to convince myself. I lay there for what seemed like an eternity, too afraid to sleep, too scared to even close my eyes. The wind rustled the leaves, but it was the only sound that broke the silence. When morning finally came, I was still lying there in the clearing, cold and shaken. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting light on the forest. I felt an odd sense of relief. I slowly gathered my things and made my way back to the trail. The forest seemed different now, less ominous, more familiar. But the memory of the night still lingered in my mind. I never went back to that spot again. Some places are better left alone. I don't know what I experienced that night, but I know one thing for sure. There was something in those woods, something that made my skin crawl, something I couldn't explain. I've been camping many times since, but I always choose a spot closer to the trail, where the shadows don't seem as deep. Some things, I suppose, are meant to remain unknown. I'd always loved camping. Growing up, it was something my family did every summer, and even as an adult, I found myself drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. There was something about being out there, surrounded by the trees and the open sky, that made everything feel right. It was like the world paused, and for a brief moment, I could just breathe. But this trip was different. I'd been planning it for months. I wanted to get away from everything, to find a place far off the beaten path where I could disconnect completely. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and nature. The kind of place where I could set up camp, build a fire, and just enjoy the peace. After a bit of searching, I found the perfect spot. A secluded area deep in the woods, near a small stream. The map didn't show any nearby campsites, and I couldn't find any reviews online. It seemed like the perfect escape. I loaded up my car with all the gear I'd need. Tent, sleeping bag, food, and a couple of books. It was a little over an hour's drive, but once I got there, the road ended, and a well-worn trail led into the trees. The kind of trail that barely looked like a trail at all, only worn down by a few footsteps. I grabbed my pack and set off on foot, eager to see what this place had to offer. The sun was starting to dip below the trees when I finally reached the campsite. It wasn't much, just a clearing by the stream, but it was perfect for what I had in mind. The ground was soft, covered in moss, and the air smelled fresh, crisp, and clean. It was quiet too. No other campers, no hikers. Just the sound of the water flowing in the stream and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and unpacked my supplies. The woods felt alive, but in a peaceful way. There were birds chirping in the distance, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Nothing out of the ordinary. I made some dinner and sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the flames as they danced in the cool night air. For a moment, everything felt right, but as the night wore on, something began to feel off. At first, it was subtle, just a sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but I couldn't help but feel like there was something, or someone, watching me from the trees. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire, but then I heard it, a soft noise like the crunch of leaves. It was faint but distinct. It came from the direction of the woods. I sat still, straining my ears, but there was nothing after that. I dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, and continued with my evening. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every so often, I'd hear another rustle or movement, and my heart would skip a beat. But each time I looked around, there was nothing there, just the shadows of the trees stretching long in the firelight. As the hours passed, the forest grew darker, the shadows deeper. I thought about going to bed, but something held me back. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. There was something else out there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it like a presence in the trees, just out of sight. I stoked the fire, hoping the flames would offer some reassurance, but they only flickered in the wind, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. That's when I heard it again, a louder crunch this time, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was close, too close. I looked toward the sound, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the firelight. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and turned it on, scanning the area around me. The beam of light cut through the night, illuminating the trees and the underbrush. I shone it in every direction, but there was nothing. No movement, no shape, just the emptiness of the woods. But then I saw something, a flicker of motion, just a shadow really moving quickly between the trees. It was too fast for me to catch a clear glimpse of it, but it was there, and it was real. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. My mind raced. What could it be? A bear? A mountain lion? But then, why was it staying so close? And why wasn't it attacking? I grabbed a stick from the fire and held it tightly in my hand, unsure of what I might have to defend myself against. I waited, listening. The noises had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. My flashlight shook in my hand as I continued to scan the darkness. Then the sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step, followed by another. Whatever it was circling me. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing. I took a few steps away from the fire, trying to get a better view of the surroundings. The forest was silent, but my every instinct screamed at me to leave. I needed to get out of here. I turned to grab my pack, ready to throw everything into my tent and head for the trail. But then I heard it, a low growl. It wasn't like any animal sound I had ever heard before. It wasn't the deep, rumbling growl of a bear or the hiss of a cougar. It was different, more human almost, sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my gear and threw it into the tent, my hands trembling as I zipped it shut. I was about to pack up the rest of my things when the growl came again, louder this time, followed by a rustling sound from the trees. I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight, my pack, and everything I could carry, and I bolted for the trail. I didn't look back, not even once. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the sharp branches that scraped my skin. I kept running, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hands. The trail was harder to see now, and I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. The sounds behind me were growing louder, closer. I could hear something following me, but I dared not look back. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to get as far away as I could. Finally, after what felt like hours, I burst out of the woods and into the clearing where I had parked my car. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I threw my gear into the back seat and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and without hesitation, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding down the narrow road and away from that place. I didn't look back. The drive back felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. Had it been an animal? Person? I didn't know, but I didn't care to find out. I just wanted to be as far away from that forest as possible. When I finally got back to town, I didn't stop. I didn't go back to my apartment. I just drove, straight through the night, until I found myself in a motel in a small town on the other side of the state. I checked in, locked the door behind me, and collapsed on the bed, still trembling. The next morning, I woke up and packed up my things. I didn't want to stay in that town any longer. Couldn't. I drove back home, avoiding the woods, avoiding the places I'd been before. The trip had been a disaster, and I had no intention of ever returning to that forest. I still don't know what it was out there. I don't know if it was an animal, a person, or something else. All I know is that I wasn't welcome, and it was too close for comfort. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but after what I experienced, I never want to find out. To this day, I avoid that forest. I don't know what happened out there, and I don't want to. Some things are better left unexplored. I had never been a fan of camping. Something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and dark, silent woods, always made me uneasy. But when my friends convinced me to join them on a weekend trip, I reluctantly agreed. After all, it wasn't like I had anything better to do, and they promised it would be an adventure. We headed out to a remote campground a few hours away from the city. The place was known for being secluded, quiet, and far off the beaten path. I could tell from the winding roads, the further we drove, that the place was more isolated than I expected. The air had a sharp, crisp quality to it, the kind that bites your skin and makes your nose feel cold as you breathe. The woods were thick, with towering trees that blocked out the sun, and the feeling of isolation settled in quickly. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping behind the horizon. The group set up camp quickly, pitching tents and starting a fire in the center of our clearing. The sounds of nature filled the air, rustling leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional snap of a branch. I couldn't deny it. The place was beautiful, in a wild, untamed way, but there was a certain stillness to it, too. An unnatural quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. As the night rolled in, the fire crackled and we huddled around it, roasting marshmallows and chatting about random things. But the deeper I looked into the shadows of the trees, the more uneasy I felt. There was something out there, something just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself it was just the typical paranoia you get when you're out in the woods. But it didn't go away. I couldn't get comfortable, no matter how hard I tried. Every time I looked away from the fire, the darkness seemed to get deeper, more impenetrable. My friends seemed oblivious, laughing and joking, completely at ease with the wilderness. I envied them for their confidence, their ease in the woods. I, on the other hand, kept thinking about the stories I'd heard about people getting lost, about strange things happening in the woods. My mind kept drifting back to those stories, to the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and walked a short distance away from the fire, hoping the cool night air would help clear my head. I hadn't realized just how much I had wandered until I found myself standing on the edge of the clearing, staring into the thick woods. The silence was almost deafening. I turned back toward the campfire, about to walk back, when something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe an animal darting between the trunks. But then I saw it again, a figure tall and thin, moving in the shadows. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to call out to my friends, but something held me back. The figure wasn't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. It seemed almost human, but there was something about it that felt wrong, unnatural. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, and before I knew it, the figure was gone, swallowed up by the trees. I blinked, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen anything. I must have imagined it, I thought. I'd been staring at the darkness for too long, my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. When I finally made it back to the campfire, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. My friends were still chatting, their voices too loud and carefree, oblivious to the tension that was building inside me. I tried to join in, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that figure in the woods. The way it had moved, the eerie stillness around it, how it seemed to vanish into the trees as if it had never been there at all. The fire started to die down, and the night air grew colder. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there watching us. At some point, we decided to turn in for the night. I was the last to crawl into my tent, my nerves on edge, trying to ignore the persistent feeling that something wasn't right. I zipped the tent flap shut and tried to sleep, but it wasn't long before the sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder. Twigs snapping, something moving just outside my tent. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. The sounds were faint, but there. Not animals, not the wind. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my tent. I couldn't move. My heart was racing, and every muscle in my body was frozen with fear. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I told myself it was just the wind, just animals, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then I heard it, a low, guttural noise, like something scraping against the ground. It was close, far too close. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling, and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But I knew something was out there. I could feel it. I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the night in that tent, wide awake, eyes darting to every sound, every movement. The footsteps stopped eventually, but I didn't dare fall asleep. The fear that had settled in my chest refused to leave. Morning came and I didn't feel any better. The woods were still silent, too quiet, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. My friends were already packing up, seemingly unaffected by the strange events of the night. I wanted to tell them what had happened, what I had seen, but something held me back. They would think I was overreacting, that it was just my imagination. But I knew what I had felt, what I had seen, and I wasn't going to let it go. We finished packing up and started the hike back to the car. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that someone, or something, was trailing us through the woods. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. My nerves were shot, and I couldn't relax. It wasn't until we reached the clearing near the parking lot that I finally allowed myself to breathe a little easier. We weren't out of the woods yet, but at least we were getting closer to civilization. I glanced back at the woods one last time, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching. I turned away quickly, not wanting to see more. I didn't care if it was real or if I was imagining it. I just wanted to leave. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us the entire time, something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to make its move. But it never did. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that I'll never go camping again. Not in those woods. Not anywhere. The feeling of being watched never really went away. The woods stayed with me, and the unease that settled in my chest that night has never fully disappeared. The only thing I know for certain is that whatever was out there, whatever I saw, wasn't human. And it's still out there, and I'll never be able to forget it. It had been a long week of work, and I was itching to get away from the city. The constant noise, the stress, and the unrelenting pace were getting to me. So when I finally got the chance to take a weekend off, I jumped at it. I decided to go camping alone. Just me, the trees, and the silence of the wilderness. I packed my gear the night before: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, a first aid kit, and my trusty flashlight. I didn't need anything fancy, just the basics to get me through the weekend. I told myself I'd be fine. I had been camping before, but never alone. This would be different, but I was looking forward to the solitude. The drive to the campsite was peaceful, the kind of drive you'd expect in the mountains. Narrow roads winding through dense forests, the occasional sight of wildlife, and the fresh scent of pine in the air. As I reached the campgrounds, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. Perfect. I set up camp in a quiet corner of the site, far from the few other campers who were scattered around. It wasn't until I was finished that I noticed how quiet it really was. There were no cars passing, no voices in the distance, just the sounds of nature. First, it was comforting. But after a while, the silence began to feel heavy. I shook it off and decided to go for a hike. The trail was well marked, and I followed it up into the hills. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. The light through the trees was beautiful, and the path ahead seemed inviting. But as I walked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder. The shadows stretched longer, and the sound of my footsteps on the gravel was the only thing I could hear. I had walked for about an hour when I noticed something strange. The trail ahead seemed to split, one path leading further up the mountain, the other curving to the right. I thought about it for a moment, then decided to take the right path. It looked less worn, maybe a little more adventurous. I wasn't in any rush, and I didn't mind taking the road less traveled. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were thicker, the underbrush denser, and the path grew rougher. I didn't mind, it felt wild, untamed. I was far enough from the camp now that I couldn't hear any voices or see any signs of life. The whole world felt like it had been swallowed up by the woods. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. A clearing in the woods. A strange clearing. The grass was overgrown, and there were old logs scattered around in a haphazard manner. At first, it seemed like a simple, peaceful spot, maybe an old campsite, but something about it felt wrong. The place felt abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect. It was as if it had been left in a hurry. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore a bit. I walked around the clearing, brushing aside some of the tall grass, trying to figure out what had made it seem so off. That's when I found it. Half hidden under a pile of leaves was a metal object. I pulled it out, careful not to disturb the surroundings too much. It was a small, rusted knife, its blade chipped and worn, as if it had been there for years. My stomach twisted. It was an odd thing to find in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I thought about heading back, but the sun was setting, and the light in the woods was quickly fading. I decided to go back to the trail and head back to camp before it got too dark. But as I turned to leave, I heard something. a faint rustling from deeper in the woods. I froze. It was barely a sound, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I stood still, listening intently. Came again, this time louder. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees, but all I saw was the darkness gathering at the edges of the clearing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My gut told me to get out of there, but I stood there frozen for a few more seconds, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. I took a step back toward the path, but the rustling continued. It was getting closer. My pulse quickened. The clearing, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt like a trap. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in on me. I turned and sprinted back to the trail. My breath was coming fast, and my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't dare look back. The sound of my footsteps was drowned out by the beating of my own heart in my ears. When I finally broke through the tree line and back onto the main trail, I didn't stop. I kept running, ignoring the pain in my legs and the sharp breaths in my throat. The trail was still faintly lit by the dying light of the sun, but everything around me felt wrong. The quiet, the stillness, it was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I finally reached my camp, but it didn't feel like the safe haven I had hoped for. It felt empty. Something had changed. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and checked my tent. It was exactly where I had left it, but there was something off about the way it sat. The ground was slightly disturbed around it, as if someone or something had been near. I told myself it was just my nerves. I wasn't thinking straight. I was overreacting. So I set up a fire and tried to calm down. The crackling flames were comforting, and I focused on them, letting my mind wander to less alarming thoughts. But then I heard it again, the rustling. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from the trees just beyond the reach of my firelight. My heart leapt in my chest. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I sat back down, my mind racing. Was it just an animal? Was I imagining things? But as the night wore on, the rustling didn't stop. It wasn't a random animal sound. It was something else, something intentional. I knew then that I couldn't stay in this camp any longer. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought it would die on me. But it held strong, and I grabbed my bag and began to move. There was no way I was staying in that camp, not with whatever was lurking nearby. I made my way down the trail, back toward the main road. The woods felt different in the dark. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had come for. It was a silence that felt thick, oppressive. I kept my eyes darting around, half expecting something to jump out from the shadows. The rest of the night was a blur of movement. I didn't stop walking until I reached the main road. When I did, I felt a huge sense of relief. I was out of the woods, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I walked for miles until I reached the nearest town. It wasn't a big place, but it had a small motel where I rented a room for the night. I didn't care how much it cost. I just wanted to sleep somewhere that wasn't in the woods. The next morning, I drove back to the city, my mind still racing with what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to, but something in that forest had been wrong. I didn't go back to that campground. I didn't even go near that part of the woods again. Something told me that if I did, I'd never leave the same way again. And as I sit here now, writing this, I still don't know what I heard or what I saw. But I do know this. There's something in the woods that doesn't want to be found. Something that waits for people like me to wander too far. And next time, I won't be so lucky. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just a weekend out in the woods, a break from the usual grind of work and life. My friend Jake had convinced me to join him, and I wasn't one to say no to an adventure, especially one where the biggest concerns were whether the campfire would last long enough and if the s'mores would turn out just right. We had decided on a spot that was far enough from the main trail, a secluded area by a small creek. It was the kind of place where you could set up camp without the noise of other campers or the constant hum of civilization in the background. The kind of place where you could feel like you were truly out in nature. The first few hours were perfect. The sun was setting as we set up the tent, the crackling of the fire soon filling the air, and the smell of burning wood mixing with the fresh scent of the trees. Felt peaceful, a quiet calm that made the worries of everyday life seem far away. Jake and I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting about old memories. Nothing special, just two friends enjoying a simple moment in the wilderness. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a growing sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long, shifting shadows, and the occasional rustle in the bushes made me glance over my shoulder. I tried to shake it off. It was just the wilderness, right? Animals, wind, the usual sounds of nature. Nothing to be afraid of. But then the sounds grew more distinct. The rustling didn't sound like wind anymore. It wasn't the usual scurrying of small animals either. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Something or someone was out there. I stood up and looked around, my eyes straining in the dim light of the fire. The forest beyond the camp seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, thick with trees and underbrush. "Did you hear that?" I asked Jake. He looked up from the fire, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, I thought it was just the wind." I didn't say anything more, but I wasn't convinced. I hadn't heard anything like it before, and it was too close for comfort. It wasn't just the wind. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Jake and I both tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the usual nighttime noises in the woods, but the feeling lingered. We finished up our food and put out the fire, retreating into the safety of the tent. As we lay there in the darkness, the sounds outside seemed to get louder, more frequent. The occasional snap of a twig, the heavy, deliberate footfalls. I could tell Jake was just as unnerved as I was, though neither of us admitted it. I tried to push it out of my mind, but sleep was elusive. The sounds outside had become so regular now that I was sure someone was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. I told myself it was probably just a deer or something else harmless, but every little noise seemed amplified in the silence of the forest. I finally managed to fall asleep, but the rest didn't last long. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of something moving around the camp again. This time it was closer. A low, rasping breath seemed to come from just outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, barely daring to breathe. I didn't move, not even an inch, waiting to hear if the sound would fade. Didn't. The breath came again, louder this time, and then a soft thud, as though something was pressing against the tent. I could feel the fabric shift slightly, as if someone was outside, pushing against it. I wanted to shout, to call out to Jake, but my voice was caught in my throat. My mind was racing, spinning with panic. What was out there? Who was out there? I reached over slowly, careful not to make any noise, and tapped Jake on the shoulder. His eyes snapped open wide with fear. He had heard it too. We both lay there, staring at the tent wall, listening to the steady, rhythmic movement just outside. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. The seconds dragged on, but eventually, the sounds faded into the distance. I lay there, tense, waiting, listening for any sign that whatever had been out there had left. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to breathe again. But I didn't move. Neither of us did. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, and the first light of dawn was a welcome sight. As soon as the sun began to rise, we packed up in a hurry. The air felt colder now, the forest quieter, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there, and it wasn't just the usual wildlife. We packed up quickly, hardly saying a word, both of us eager to leave. As we were heading down the trail back to the car, we noticed something strange. Fresh footprints. Not animal tracks, but human, barefoot. They were leading in the direction we had come from, and they were recent. The prints were still fresh in the damp earth. Jake and I exchanged a glance, both of us silently agreeing that we didn't want to stick around any longer. We hurried back to the car, the quiet woods now feeling overwhelmingly oppressive. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints from my mind. The idea that someone had been out there watching us, moving through the woods just beyond the safety of the campfire. That night, as we sat in a diner miles away from the woods, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Who was out there? Why had they been watching us? And what did they want? The thought of it made my skin crawl. I didn't know if I would ever go camping again, at least not in a place that felt so isolated. But that was the thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't gone. They were still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in nature, away from the chaos of the city, that made everything feel right. The rustling of the leaves, the scent of pine, the crackling of a campfire. All of it was just so peaceful. I had gone camping countless times before, but this time was different. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway to enjoy the fresh air and escape from the grind. But it turned into something I'll never forget. I drove up to the campsite by myself. The place I chose was a little off the beaten path, deep in a forest, surrounded by towering trees. It wasn't a typical, well-known campground that people flocked to during weekends. This spot was more isolated, tucked away in a quiet corner of the forest where the trails were barely marked, and there were no nearby rangers or bustling crowds. I liked that. I wanted solitude, and I wanted to disconnect from everything for a while. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon as I unpacked my gear. I set up my tent and then began to gather some wood for the campfire. There was something about building the fire that felt almost meditative, watching the sparks fly up into the air and feeling the warmth spread across my face. The forest was quiet, but not too quiet. I could hear the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustling of animals moving through the underbrush. Once the fire was going, I settled down with a book, the flames flickering in front of me. The night was drawing in, and the temperature dropped significantly. I threw on a jacket, but I was still comfortable. The sound of the fire crackling was the only thing that broke the silence, and for a moment, I felt like I could stay there forever. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a low rustling in the bushes. I paused, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the noise stopped as quickly as it had started. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. It wasn't unusual to hear wildlife in the forest, especially at night. Still, something about it felt off. I shook it off and went back to my book. A few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. It was definitely something moving in the woods, and it wasn't the typical scurrying of a small animal. This was heavier, more deliberate. I stood up, walking a few paces from the fire, trying to get a better sense of where the sound was coming from. There was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind and the occasional snap of a twig. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching me. I glanced around the campsite, half expecting to see someone standing just outside the light of the fire. But there was no one. The woods were still. I figured I was just being paranoid, the result of too many horror stories and late-night campfire tales. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy quiet. I stayed close to the fire, not wanting to venture too far from its comforting warmth. Every now and then, I thought I could hear something moving in the shadows, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep much that night, tossing and turning in my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest playing tricks on my mind. By morning, the weird feeling had faded, replaced by the usual serenity of the forest. The sun broke through the trees, casting golden beams of light across the campsite. I made breakfast and packed up my things, deciding to take a short hike before heading home. I figured a bit of daylight would clear my head and give me a chance to enjoy the rest of the day. The trail was overgrown, with thick shrubs and tall grasses brushing against my legs as I walked. The path was narrow, and I had to keep an eye out for roots and rocks that could trip me up. The further I went, the quieter the woods became. There was no sound of birds or animals now, just the wind through the trees and my footsteps crunching along the forest floor. I didn't realize how deep I had gone until I came across a strange clearing. It was a small, open area, but there was something unsettling about it. The grass was trampled, and there were signs of a fire pit, though the ashes had long since cooled. What struck me most, though, was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I stood in the clearing for a moment, scanning the surroundings. There were no other campers, no signs of anyone else being in the area. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I turned to leave, but as I took a step, I froze. There, on the edge of the clearing, was a piece of cloth, dark and torn. I bent down to get a closer look, my heart racing. It wasn't the kind of cloth I'd expect to find in the woods, especially not in such a remote spot. It looked like part of a jacket or a bag. My stomach twisted as I realized it looked recent. Suddenly, I heard a snap behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. I wasn't sure what I had heard, but I had no intention of sticking around to find out. The feeling of dread that had crept up on me earlier came rushing back, stronger than ever. I quickly retraced my steps, heading back toward the campsite. The walk felt longer now, as if the forest had changed somehow, as if the trees themselves were watching me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. But when I looked behind me, there was nothing there. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. By the time I made it back to the campsite, I was sweating and my heart was racing. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, not bothering to enjoy the calmness of the forest anymore. I just wanted to leave. But as I reached my car, something caught my eye, something in the trees. I glanced over, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing between the trunks. Person, maybe, or something else. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. The road back was long, winding, and quiet, and as I passed the turnoff to the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the distance, movement among the trees. I couldn't be sure, but I didn't want to look again. I just wanted to get home. It took me hours to get back to the city, but the feeling of unease never left me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't stop thinking about the forest, the clearing, and the torn piece of cloth. What had I seen out there? Was it someone else? And who or what had been watching me? As it turned out, the answer came a few days later. A news report flashed across the screen as I sat down to breakfast. A local hiker had gone missing, and authorities were asking for any information. They showed a photo of the missing person, and my stomach dropped. It was a man I had seen in the campsite parking lot the day I arrived. He had been parked nearby, looking disheveled, but I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Now, I realized that the unsettling feeling I had experienced that night, the strange noises, and the torn cloth were all signs that something wasn't right. I had narrowly avoided getting caught up in something much darker than a simple camping trip. I wasn't sure what happened out there, but I was certain of one thing. I wouldn't be returning to that campsite again. I'd had enough of the woods. The next time I went camping, it would be somewhere a lot less isolated. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me and a few friends. We'd picked out a remote spot deep in the woods, away from the usual crowds. The idea was to disconnect from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just nature. The kind of trip where you could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. I should have known better. The drive up was easy enough, the winding mountain roads familiar, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, a soft breeze, and the kind of temperature that made you feel like you were finally away from everything. We found the campsite, tucked beside a small stream, and started setting up. The tents went up with little trouble. We joked around, unpacked our gear, and even managed to start a fire. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the distant rush of the water in the stream. I remember feeling good, peace. For the first time in a while, I wasn't worried about work, life, or anything else, just the here and now. As the sun started to dip below the tree-line, we cooked our dinner. Nothing fancy, just some campfire food. Hot dogs, beans, and s'mores. We sat around the fire, enjoying the simple pleasure of being outside. But as the night wore on, a weird feeling settled in. First, I thought it was just the quiet, the kind of silence you only find deep in the woods, where the usual hum of city life is replaced by something different. But then it was more than just quiet. There was something off about the air, like it was too still, almost too thick. The fire crackled, and the trees whispered in the breeze. But there was an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. I shook it off, blaming it on the isolation. After all, we were miles from the nearest road, and the thought of that kind of distance in the woods always felt more unsettling than it should. But when the others went to bed, that sense of unease grew. I stayed up a little longer than I intended. The fire was dying down, the embers flickering in the darkness, and I could feel the cold creeping in. It wasn't long before I decided to turn in myself. But as I stood up, something caught my eye. A movement in the shadows at the edge of the campsite. My first thought was that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some small creature rustling in the bushes. But it didn't move like any animal I knew. The shape was too deliberate, too human. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring into the darkness. The figure was standing just outside the reach of the firelight. I couldn't make out much detail, just the outline of a person. No sound, no movement, just stillness. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. No response. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was a shadow or just a trick of the firelight. But the more I stared, the more I felt a growing sense of dread. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear. I tried to shake off the fear and told myself it was nothing. But it wasn't that simple. There was something in the air now, something wrong. I turned away from the figure and went into the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. The inside of the tent was warm, and I tried to push the strange feeling aside. I zipped it up and lay down, pulling the sleeping bag around me. But no matter how much I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the thin fabric of the tent. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, straining to hear anything. The wind rustled the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig echoed through the woods, but nothing else. I had the overwhelming urge to look outside, but I resisted. I knew if I looked, I wouldn't like what I saw. Finally, I managed to drift off to sleep, though it wasn't restful. I woke up several times during the night, my heart racing, but I never opened the tent. The feeling never went away. When morning came, the sun was still low in the sky. I woke to find the campsite eerily quiet. The others were still asleep, and the fire had burned out completely. The air felt colder than it had the night before. I had no intention of going back to sleep. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to leave. But I didn't want to wake the others, not yet. I decided to make some coffee and wait for them to wake up on their own. As I sat by the dying embers of the fire, sipping my coffee, I noticed something strange in the dirt near the edge of the campsite. Footprints, fresh ones. They were deep and wide, the kind of prints you'd expect from someone who was wearing heavy boots. But the odd thing was, there were only a few, like someone had walked through the camp and then stopped. Not the usual trail you'd expect from someone walking through the woods, just a few isolated prints. The tracks didn't lead anywhere specific, just stopped. I could feel my heart rate pick up again. I stood up, my eyes scanning the trees, but I didn't see anything. No one in sight. I thought about waking the others, but I hesitated. They'd think I was overreacting. Maybe I was, but I couldn't ignore the fear in my gut. When they finally woke up, I showed them the tracks. They agreed that it was weird, but they didn't seem as concerned as I was. We decided to pack up and head out. The trip wasn't ruined, it wasn't a big deal, but I was done. I didn't want to stay another night. As we packed up the campsite, I kept my eyes on the tree line, half expecting to see something, but nothing moved. The woods felt normal again, or as normal as they could be after what I'd experienced. We hiked back down the mountain, and the further we got from the campsite, the more my nerves started to calm. The air felt lighter, the world around me felt more open, and I could breathe again. By the time we reached the car, I couldn't help but let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We drove out of the mountains without looking back. But I'll never forget that feeling, the one that had gnawed at me in the dark. I don't know who or what had been in those woods, but I'm sure of one thing: we weren't alone. I still don't know who was out there, and I still don't want to know. But that's the last time I'll camp that deep in the woods. Sometimes some places are just better left alone. Camping has always been a way for me to escape the noise of everyday life. I've always loved the idea of solitude in nature, a time to disconnect, reset, and just exist without the constant hum of responsibilities. Last autumn, I decided to spend a long weekend camping in a remote forest. It wasn't my first solo trip, but it was the first time I ventured into a location as isolated as this one. The area I chose was deep in the Adirondacks, far from any marked trails. I had done my research, poring over maps and reading up on the terrain. There was no cell service in that part of the forest, but that was the point. I packed meticulously. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 4 days, a first aid kit, a portable stove, and my trusted camping knife. I even carried a satellite GPS device just in case. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 5 hours. I parked my car on a gravel road that seemed seldom used, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The crisp air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sound of leaves crunching under my boots was oddly soothing. The forest felt alive. Birds chirped above, and I occasionally spotted squirrels darting up trees. Everything seemed perfect. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached a spot that felt right. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a clear view of the sky above. A narrow creek ran nearby, its gentle trickling adding to the serene atmosphere. I set up my tent and arranged my gear, making sure everything was in its place. By the time I finished, The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I built a small fire to cook my dinner, then sat back and watched as the forest transitioned from day to night. The temperature dropped quickly, but the fire kept me warm. The stars began to appear, scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds. It was beautiful. As the fire dwindled, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, feeling refreshed. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek for a while, marveling at how untouched everything felt. There were no footprints, no signs of human activity. It was just me and the wilderness. By midday, I returned to my campsite to find everything as I had left it. I spent the afternoon reading a book, occasionally glancing up to watch birds flit between the trees. As the sun began to set again, I prepared another simple meal and settled in for the evening. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. About 20 yards from my camp, a tree branch hung at an odd angle, as if it had been snapped. It hadn't been like that earlier in the day. I walked over to inspect it, shining my flashlight on the broken wood. The break was clean, almost too clean. I brushed it off as natural. Perhaps it had been weakened and finally gave way. Still, it left me feeling uneasy. The second night was different. I woke up to a faint sound, like twigs snapping. It was subtle, but in the stillness of the forest, it was enough to jolt me awake. I lay there listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't rhythmic like an animal, it felt deliberate. I held my breath, my ears straining. After a few minutes, the noise stopped, and the forest returned to its usual quiet. I convinced myself it was just an animal and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Near the edge of the clearing, where the grass met the trees, there was a single footprint. It wasn't mine. I crouched down to examine it. It was larger than my boot and had a distinct tread pattern, the kind you'd find on heavy-duty hiking boots. My mind raced. I hadn't seen or heard anyone during my hike in. There were no other cars at the trailhead. Who could it be? I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it could have been an old footprint, though the ground was damp and it looked fresh. I considered packing up and leaving, but decided against it. I had come all this way for solitude, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin it. That evening, I made sure to keep the fire going longer than usual. The flickering flames provided a sense of security, however false it might have been. I kept my knife within arm's reach as I ate my dinner, my eyes constantly scanning the perimeter of the camp. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost as if it were holding its breath. When I finally went to bed, I struggled to fall asleep. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of twigs snapping. This time, it was unmistakably close. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound moved, circling the tent. It stopped, then started again from a different direction. I clutched my knife tightly, every muscle in my body tense. Hours seemed to pass before the noise stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as dawn broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my knife still in hand. The campsite looked normal, but I felt anything but. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, relief washed over me. I threw my backpack in the trunk, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked my gear that I found the note. It was a small piece of paper, tucked into the side pocket of my backpack. The handwriting was messy, almost childlike. It read, You're lucky I let you leave. I don't camp alone anymore. I've always loved camping. It's a chance to step away from the noise of everyday life and find some peace in nature. That's why, when I got a few days off work, I packed up my gear and headed for a remote spot in the mountains. I'd been there before and remembered it as the perfect getaway. Far from any towns, with no cell service, and surrounded by miles of forest. The drive up was uneventful. The weather was perfect, crisp, clear skies with just enough of a chill to make a campfire feel cozy. I parked my car at the base of the trailhead and started hiking in. It was late afternoon, and the sunlight streamed through the trees in golden beams. My backpack was heavy with supplies, but I didn't mind. I liked the effort. It made the reward of setting up camp even better. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the spot. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a stream running nearby. I camped there before, and it was just as beautiful as I remembered. The stream was running clear, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was sitting by the fire, eating a simple dinner and feeling completely at peace. As the stars came out, I stretched out by the fire and stared up at the sky. It was so clear that I could see the Milky Way. Moments like that made the hike worth it. I stayed up for a while, just soaking it all in, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep. The first night passed without incident. I woke up with the sun filtering through the tent and the sound of the stream in the background. After a quick breakfast, I decided to spend the day exploring the area. I followed the stream for a while, then climbed up a small ridge to get a better view of the surrounding forest. It was endless green, stretching out in every direction. There was no sign of civilization, and I loved it. Around midday, I headed back to camp, made some lunch, and spent the afternoon reading and relaxing. It was exactly the kind of break I'd needed. As the sun started to set, I got the fire going again and prepared for another quiet evening. That's when I first noticed something strange. It started with the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I dismissed it. After all, I was miles from anywhere, and I hadn't seen another person since leaving my car. But as the evening went on, the feeling grew stronger. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder or scanning the trees around the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the unease. I tried to ignore it and focus on the fire, but then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the woods. It was distant at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. The steps would start, then stop, as if whoever was making them was trying to stay hidden. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. Shining it into the trees, I called out, hoping it was just another camper or maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost. But there was no response. The footsteps stopped, and the woods went silent. I kept the flashlight trained on the spot where I thought I'd heard the sound, but there was nothing there. After a few minutes, I sat back down, telling myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered close to camp. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the night was tense. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I stayed up later than I'd planned, keeping the fire going as a source of comfort. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled into my tent. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the forest, but eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural noise, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was close, too close. My heart was racing as I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. I shone the flashlight around, but the light seemed swallowed by the darkness. Then I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood watching me. My first thought was that it was a person, but something about the way it moved wasn't right. It was too still, almost as if it was waiting for something. The flashlight beam flickered as my hands shook, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I scrambled back into the tent and grabbed the small knife I always kept in my pack. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It didn't make any sense. I'd seen no sign of anyone else out here, and it was too remote for someone to just stumble upon my camp. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, clutching the knife and listening for any sign of movement. But whoever or whatever had been there didn't come back. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The peacefulness of the forest had been replaced by an oppressive sense of dread. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and by the time I reached the parking lot, I was drenched in sweat and exhausted. When I finally got into my car and locked the doors, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as I drove away, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the forest. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened. I've gone camping countless times, but I haven't been able to bring myself to go back out there. Something was in those woods with me that night, and while I'll probably never know what it was, I'm certain of one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the winding forest trail. My backpack felt heavier with each step, the straps digging into my shoulders. The air was crisp and cool, perfect for camping. I'd been looking forward to this solo trip for months, a chance to disconnect from the grind of daily life and immerse myself in nature. It was just me, the forest, and the stars for the weekend. The trail led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew taller and denser. Birds chirped sporadically, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone out here. By the time I reached the clearing I'd picked out on the map, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I dropped my pack and stretched, taking in the surroundings. The clearing was small, bordered by towering pines. A shallow creek ran nearby, its gentle gurgling a soothing backdrop. This was exactly what I'd been craving. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and built a small fire. As the flames crackled, I heated a simple meal and ate it slowly, savoring the quiet. The sky above darkened to a deep navy, and stars began to appear one by one. I leaned back against a log, staring up at the constellations. The night deepened, and the forest grew quieter. The kind of quiet that wasn't comforting but heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I'd read about this phenomenon, how nature's silence could feel louder than noise, but experiencing it firsthand was unsettling. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my city habits. I wasn't used to this level of stillness. The first sign of trouble came around midnight. I was lying in my tent, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. A faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon. Still, I reached for the flashlight by my side and waited, straining to hear more. The sound didn't repeat, and after what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was nothing. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise outside seemed amplified, from the rustling leaves to the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. My heart was racing again, and the tent was pitch black. I fumbled for my flashlight, and as I clicked it on, the beam illuminated the inside of the tent. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Listening carefully, I realized the forest was completely silent again. No insects, no rustling, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. I stayed awake for hours, my flashlight clutched in one hand, until the first light of dawn filtered through the tent. Morning brought a sense of relief. The chirping birds and soft sunlight made the previous night feel distant and less threatening. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to stay closer to camp that day, exploring the area around the clearing rather than venturing too far. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with sunbeams filtering through the canopy and the earthy smell of pine and moss filling the air. I spent the morning gathering firewood and refilling my water supply at the creek. As the day wore on, I began to relax. The rational part of me dismissed the night's events as overactive imagination. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a larger fire than the previous night. The flames felt like a barrier against the encroaching darkness. I ate dinner and stayed by the fire until my eyes grew heavy. When I finally retreated to the tent, I left the fire burning low, hoping it would keep animals away. I was woken again, this time by a distinct sound, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, ears straining to pinpoint the direction. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Whoever or whatever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then the zipper of the tent moved. Not fully, just a subtle shift, as if someone was testing it. My mind raced. Should I yell? Grab the knife in my pack? Before I could decide, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before daring to move. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. Nothing looked out of place, but the unease was overwhelming. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At the first light of dawn, I packed up camp as quickly as I could. I decided to cut the trip short. Whatever had happened, I didn't feel safe staying another night. The trail back to the car felt longer than it should have, every snap of a twig making me jump. When I finally reached the parking lot, relief washed over me. The sight of my car felt like salvation. As I loaded my gear into the trunk, I glanced back at the trail. The forest seemed peaceful in the daylight, almost inviting. But I knew better. Something or someone had been out there with me, and I wasn't eager to find out what or why. Driving away, I replayed the events in my mind. I'd come to the woods seeking solitude and peace, but I'd found something else entirely. To this day, I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a person passing through, or maybe it was something more sinister. Either way, it reminded me of an important truth. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes it's better to admire it from a distance. It started as an ordinary weekend camping trip. Just me, my backpack, and a plan to get away from the buzz of daily life. I had picked a remote spot in the middle of a national forest, far enough away from any major trails that I could feel truly alone. I craved solitude, the kind where you hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves from animals passing by. I had no idea how much I'd come to regret seeking that isolation. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning. The air was crisp, with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. My pack was heavier than I liked, loaded with enough supplies for a 2-night stay. The trail started out well-marked but quickly narrowed as I veered off onto a less-traveled route. This was part of my plan, to escape the crowds and find a spot where I wouldn't see another soul. The hike in was uneventful at first. I passed through groves of towering trees, their roots snaking across the ground like veins. Occasionally, I paused to sip water or adjust my pack. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing by a creek. It seemed perfect. Flat ground for my tent, a reliable water source, and just enough canopy coverage to shield me from the morning sun. I set up camp methodically. The tent went up without a hitch, and I gathered stones to form a fire ring. After collecting enough dry wood to last the night, I sat by the creek, letting the cold water run over my hands. The isolation was everything I'd hoped for. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. By nightfall, I had a small fire crackling. I cooked a simple meal over it, the smell of instant noodles mixing with the smoky air. The stars came out in full force, unfiltered by city lights. I felt a deep sense of peace as I sat there, staring into the flames. That feeling didn't last. It started subtly. A faint sound, like a branch snapping, came from somewhere beyond the firelight. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. The forest is full of noises at night, and I wasn't new to camping. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. It wasn't just the sound. It was the silence that followed. The usual background noise of insects and distant owls seemed to have vanished. I turned my head toward the direction of the sound, peering into the darkness. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, the trees formed an impenetrable wall of black. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're being watched. I shook it off, convincing myself it was my imagination. To be safe, I added more wood to the fire, letting the flames grow taller. Eventually, the tension eased. I reasoned that the forest was alive, and I couldn't let every little noise unsettle me. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. My sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and the fatigue from the hike quickly pulled me towards sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. For a moment, I couldn't figure out why. My heart was pounding, and my ears strained to catch any sound. Then I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. They weren't fast or erratic. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to move quietly but couldn't avoid making noise. I froze, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. My mind raced. Could be another camper, but what were the odds? I had gone out of my way to find a remote spot. Besides, anyone else out here would have called out or made themselves known by now. I grabbed the small knife I kept in my pack, my only weapon. The thin nylon of the tent suddenly felt like no protection at all. The footsteps circled my campsite, slow and measured. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig, the shuffle of leaves. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I sat there in the dark, gripping the knife, my ears straining for any hint of movement. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I emerged from the tent cautiously, knife still in hand. The campsite looked untouched. There were no obvious signs that anyone had been there, but the ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, making it hard to tell if there had been footprints. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote. Still, the unease lingered. I debated cutting the trip short, but decided against it. I come all this way, and I didn't want to let my imagination ruin the experience. I spent the day exploring the area, keeping my knife and a whistle within reach. The forest was beautiful, but I couldn't fully enjoy it. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I built the fire larger than the night before, feeding it steadily to keep it going. The circle of light it cast felt like a barrier between me and the darkness. I sat with my back to the tent, watching the shadows dance among the trees. Hours passed without incident, and I started to feel foolish for being so paranoid. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they came from the opposite direction. Slow, deliberate, and uncomfortably close. My pulse quickened as I scanned the darkness. I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight, but the sound was unmistakable. I stood, clutching the knife. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, the kind that makes your ears ring. I stayed there, standing by the fire, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I shouted into the darkness. A wordless yell meant to scare off whatever was out there. The response was immediate. The footsteps started again, faster this time, retreating into the forest. They faded into the distance, leaving me alone once more. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, I packed up camp as quickly as I could. My body was tense, my movements hurried. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. Every sound made me whip my head around, expecting to see. I didn't know what, but I never saw anything. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves completely frayed. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. I've replayed those nights in my head countless times since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was an animal, though the deliberate way it moved felt human. Or maybe it was another person, someone who enjoyed stalking campers for the thrill of it. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that I'll never camp alone again.